me at this point.
And it's interesting because I always thought of Sephora as a direct competitor on the more luxury side, at least when I walk in the store. I mean, that's how I feel. Who knows if I'm right? But when I walk into Sephora, I feel like these are, the more expensive version of Ulta. But
yeah.
I feel like you can find what you need when you go into Sephora, and to your point, Ulta feels like
huge.
I'm walking into this random forest.
It's funny that you're mentioning that because, yeah, so I would say Sephora does feel a little bit higher end, and then yes, Ulta, it's just really, really huge. If you don't know what you're going in there for, I feel as though yes, you're
lost.
Get lost to some degree.
All right, just real quick before you go, Tesla and GM. Let's talk about this downgrade from GM.
Yeah, GM. This is we have Bernstein cutting shares to the equivalent of a neutral, saying that the company faces a lot of earnings headwinds. There's inventory issues. There's international pressures. There's also around the EV that they're not getting that ramped up as quickly as should be. Tesla, on the other hand, up about 4%. So GM, the worst percentage mover in the S&P 500, down 3.4%. Tesla, the best percentage gainer for the S&P 500 and probably one of the top point boosts as well. It is up 4%. And, this is one of those calls, Barclays saying that they think deliveries are a little bit ahead, 10,000 above the 360,000 expectation for the third quarter. So nothing huge, but just trajectory going in the right direction. And yes, it is the top point boost by far, actually, for the S&P 500.
All right, Abigail, thank you so much. Very much appreciated. Abigail Doolittle joining us from Bloomberg. All right, let's go to someone with money in the market here. Joe Gilbert, Senior Portfolio Manager at Integrity Asset Management. He joins us from Rocky River, Ohio. Joe, good to see you. So we got through the Fed stuff. What, if you don't want to fight the Fed right now, and we got some Fed speak today, Goolsby talking about we're going to have to see some big cuts, many more cuts over the next year. Raphael Bostic saying a little bit different, that he had not locked in to large rate cuts. Kashkari saying he does want a 0.5 point percentage interest rate cut at the next meeting. I mean, I'm just saying all this, it just basically means that we're still going to get all this Fed speak, and there's going to be no clue what they do until they actually do it in November. What do you like? How do you not fight the Fed?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on, Alex. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that the old adage of don't fight the Fed will play out pretty well and meaningfully as we go through the balance of this year and the beginning of next year. And when we look at it, the way things set up for us, is a great runway and backdrop for investing in our smaller and mid-cap companies right now. Those have been the laggards on the way when rates were going up. And now we think, if there's some symmetry, which we hope is small and mid-cap managers, they will be the beneficiaries as rates are coming down, no matter what the pace will be.
Well, Joe, there's so much chatter out there in the market. What should be the focus? What are you telling your clients? Are there any specific sectors that you're eyeing?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. What we're thinking about right now is we think that from overall standpoint, as I alluded to, small and mid-cap stocks will still outperform from here. We believe value will outperform growth within the sector basis. We like financials, we like consumer discretionary, and we actually like real estate.
Where do you need to stay away from at this point? Like, what do you do with something like tech, for example?
I don't think tech is a place that you don't want to have exposure to.
Exactly.
We just think that it probably makes sense to lighten up there. I think most people, if you've been invested, just in general with the market, you're overweight tech. And if you specifically had tech exposure, you're probably outsized with that from a risk reward standpoint. So we don't think that you avoid it. We think that you probably pare that back and use those proceeds to fund some of the names and sectors that have not outperformed so far.
I mean, we just had the Fed meeting last week. What's the next catalyst? What are you looking for in the data ahead?
That's a great question. I think right now, as you guys pointed out, there's a ton of Fed speak. There's going to be a lot of push-pull going on as far as how much more they will go, how quickly they will go. And, I think ultimately within that, the biggest thing is going to be unemployment or employment. That's going to be the biggest driver. They've pretty much said inflation, they're willing, they have a higher tolerance, I think, now for inflation to kind of meander sideways. But I think that with employment, I don't know that they really have that higher of a threshold for pain there.
What about cyclicals? Before we let you go, I hear you lighten up on tech, but you kind of still need to have it. When do you really go more all into the cyclical aspects of the market, like industrials, like materials, like energy?
Yeah, I think that, that's a delicate balance. And, it's always one of those things you can always be a little bit early. But realistically, we think that this upcoming earnings season is going to be a great catalyst. It's going to probably be a good clearing event. A lot of these companies are not going to have great numbers. It's probably going to be pretty sloppy. That's a technical term there for you, the way that these companies are going to report. But I think that those are going to be clearing events that's going to happen. It's going to reset expectations and set up for a better backdrop for 2025.
All right, Joe, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Joe Gilbert, Senior Portfolio Manager at Integrity Asset Management, and jumping on with us about what to do in the market. So another headline that came out earlier this morning was the German government said it does not support a takeover of Commerce Bank by UniCredit. Commerce Bank shares over at the DAX fell on that news. They're off by about 6%. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz talking about the aggressive buying of company stakes is not appropriate, and that hostile takeovers are not a good thing. We wanted to get more on this with Philip Richards, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst of European Banks. This is confusing to me because from my understanding, they effectively own what, about 21% of Commerce Bank? Can they do that without knowledge from the actual German government?
It is quite a funny one, I agree. I mean, they actually own 9%, but they have financial derivative contracts in place to raise that towards 21.
Okay. So they could up it, but as of now, it's still just 9%.
Exactly that. They've applied to the ECB to raise it above that 10% threshold, but they haven't yet received that.
Sorry, go ahead, Nor.
No, for our U.S. listeners, is this type of consolidation typical?
It's unusual, but then Orcel was obviously very experienced and has been very much on the ball in terms of doing acquisitions in the past. This is how he spent the majority of his career. So he obviously knows there's a way of doing it without having to publicly disclose it and make it clear. But yes, it is quite rare.
So I guess I'm confused. Why does Germany not want this to happen? And again, even if it's just a 9% stake, not over that 10% threshold, wouldn't Germany had to have known this in some capacity?
Well, it's two things there. So first of all, why doesn't Germany want it? First of all, because Commerce Bank is the second largest lender to the basically what's called the SME sector in Germany, called the Mittelstand. And so they're concerned that that is taken over by a German bank. They might have by an Italian bank. They might have different priorities. For example, in times of crisis, often banks go back to their home market, so they might restrict lending, which of course Germany doesn't want to happen to its businesses. Secondly, your second point there is, could the government not have known that they increased that stake? I think it's perfectly possible. You can build out derivative positions because you don't have to disclose that. That's not it's not an actual holding.
So tensions, of course, with the German government are escalating because of this. What happens next?
Yeah. That's a very difficult one, and I literally have no answer. I mean, certainly you don't think the UniCredit would be doing this, so they thought they had a route to making a full deal. But that said, if the German government opposed it, it does seem quite difficult for them to do so. And a hostile takeover cross-border is a very difficult proposition and very different to one which is endorsed. So I think they're going to struggle with this, but I'm sure they have a plan B lined up for us.
Why would the assumption be that even though Commerce Bank lends to a lot of small, medium-sized enterprises, that if UniCredit took it over, that would go away? Because in theory, they are very different businesses to some extent. So wouldn't it just help Commerce Bank's balance sheet at the end of the day?
It would help the Commerzbank balance sheet be part of the UniCredit business overall, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But if we did go into a big financial crisis like we have a couple of times in the last 15 years or so, then the Italian, the home country of the UniCredit, Italy, might want to restrict lending overseas because it wants to improve its own capital position. So by not expanding abroad, that helps that.
So what should be the takeaway for investors?
That's a very difficult one. Again, it's very difficult to say. Obviously, we're in the middle of a whole scenario as it's going through, and we've had two big swings today, which have caught people a bit by surprise. So it is on the balance. I have no idea which way it will go at this point.
What with German government talking about hostile takeovers? Do we have a feeling that UniCredit would pursue a hostile takeover?
I've been reading various stories today. Most commentators I've seen are suggesting that they don't think they will.
Right.
That said, again, it's nothing to be new to Mr. Orcel, and I'm sure he's had a plan in place. I mean, if this happens, he must have sounded out the German government, I'd assume, before building up these big positions. So he would have known there's a negative comeback, but he must have some sort of extra plan.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, that it is a little confusing when you try to unpack it. And the reason why this is so important, I should just point out, is that would this be a template for other cross-border M&A deals within Europe?
It's not, and it does seem quite unusual, and I think normally the case is either you go hostile from the beginning, or if you can, and not by the preference, if you get an agreement from the company, to go down this route, and it's almost not Commerzbank talking, having a raft in public with the German government is not not a route anyone would really like to take. So no, I say this is quite an unusual route.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Philip, really good to get your perspective. Thanks for jumping on with us. Philip Richards, Bloomberg Intelligence, Senior Analyst of European Banks, joining us from London. Again, that headline is the German government said it does not support a takeover of Commerzbank by UniCredit that has officially built a 9% stake within the company. Let's get back to the top story of the morning. $4,000 a month apartments downtown on Wall Street. Did you figure out where the $4,000 for studios, one bedrooms, John Tucker?
You see, a good reporter would have researched that.
It's okay. That means that you can go on the ground,
I was
right?
looking at the picture in the brochure. Very nice.
Are they pretty?
They're okay.
They're okay.
It's just all right for 4K.
I mean, to be fair,
Who are these people?
John Tucker
all right.
builds stuff and
Right.
like lays tile
Yeah,
and like
yeah,
changes pipes out. Yeah. All right, coming up, we're gonna have much more for you. Andres Glusky is CEO of AES, will be joining us. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash. And
I'm John Tucker, the Bloomberg Newsroom, with this Bloomberg Business Flash. We're being brought to you by Interactive Brokers Bond Marketplace. Access their vast selection of over 1 billion global fixed income securities with no markups or built-in spreads and low, transparent commissions. Learn more at ibkr.com/bonds. Major stock averages, they are pushing higher, not by much, but it is enough for records. S&P 500 pushing through its record close, up 14 points right now. That's 0.25%, 57.17 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 44 points. That's a rise of 0.1% at 42,107. And the NASDAQ 100 still has a ways to go before it breaches that. Right now, 53 points higher. That is up 0.3%. As for bonds, the 10-year yield right now, the benchmark, up about 3 basis points, 376 there. The 2-year, that is up 1 basis point. That is at 360. Difference between the two, 16 basis points, positive 16. In the S&P 500, 9 of the 11 major industry groups, they are higher. That's being led by energy as crude oil rises above $70 a barrel. Most actively traded, Intel, as Apollo is said to offer a multi-billion-dollar investment, and as Qualcomm also floats a friendly takeover. And of course, as you're hearing this morning, the drama continues to unfold. Unicredit of Italy moving to more than double its stake in Commerzbank of Germany. The move comes as the German government indicates its opposition. Could get nasty. But we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Nora, Alex.
Thank you so much, John Tucker. I'm Alex Steele alongside Norma Linda. Paul Sweeney is in Ireland at the moment. If you see him, tell him we say hi. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you live from our Interactive Brokers studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. One of the top stories over the last couple of days has been that deal that Constellation Energy inked with Microsoft to help restart one of its nuclear power plants on 3 Mile Island. That investment about $1.6 billion. But Constellation Energy is not the only company doing stuff like this and talking to hyperscalers about how to provide energy for this massive demand for data centers and GPU chips. And one of the companies involved is also AES. It does a lot of different things. It sells renewable power to corporate customers. It deals with LNG infrastructure. It has 2 fast-growing utilities. It does a lot of stuff, yet the stock has not performed like Constellation Energy and like Vistra, which are sort of the power plays on AI. So luckily, the CEO of AES is in the studio right now with us, Andres Gleski. Andres, nice to see you.
Very nice to see you, too.
So why hasn't your stock gotten the same kind of credit that Vistra and Constellation Energy have?
Well, our stock recovered a little bit, let's say, in the last couple of weeks.
It has, yes.
But I still think, yeah, it has a long way to go. So we are the largest provider of actually renewable energy to hyperscalers in the world. So we have already 8 gigawatts signed over history. So I think that, you know, the nuclear has gotten a lot of attention. I do think nuclear is part of the solution. But we're really looking at a market that's short energy to really be able to implement the AI revolution and the amount of data centers that are needed.
I know just last month you all were saying that you see demand at Midwest utilities rising 50% on data centers. So of course, that's really been the conversation about AI. What is your expectation for how much more power demand you'll need to produce to meet data center demand?
Well, the truth is right now, anything that you can get built on the renewable space in the right areas, you can contract. So there's really a shortage. In the case of the utilities, this is a very nice story because one of them is Dayton, Ohio. We call it AES Ohio. And it was really a city that had suffered a lot, you know, with the deindustrialization of the U.S. And what we're seeing is we contracted for about 2 gigawatts of new data centers coming into that area. But you also have an EV plant and a battery plant coming in. So it's great to see this area reindustrializing and, you know, growing again. So it's an area that, you know, its population is probably half of what it was in the 70s. So there's a lot of, you know, there's water available, there's interconnection, there's everything else. So it's really, it's a great spot to locate data centers.
A couple dumb questions for you. When we talk about renewable power to some of the data centers, for example, or the hyperscalers, what does that actually mean for AES? And what kind of partnerships do you currently have, and who are you talking to? That was 3 questions right there.
Yeah, well, let's see. Sometimes we're not able to say, you know, who exactly are the different partners. Mm-hmm. What I can say is that it's, you know, pretty much all of the big ones.
Okay.
We do have the largest solar plus storage project in the country being built right now. And that's with Amazon Web Services, AWS in California. And that's 2 gigawatts, just that one facility. So we have a backlog of about 12 gigawatts that we have to build over the next maximum 3 years, all of it. And we're signing of about 5 gigawatts a year. So to put it in perspective, something like, let's say, putting the unit on 3 Mile Island back online, that's probably about 850 megawatts. And we are talking about, 5 gigawatts a year that we're signing. So there's, I see nuclear as part of the solution, but it's not going to displace renewables, certainly not in the next decade.
And when we think about Microsoft striking that contract with Constellation Energy, do you feel like that positive sentiment has permeated through the market in terms of thinking about renewable energy utilities?
No, I think the market's still thinking of it a little bit like a zero-sum game. And it's not understanding sort of energy markets, because what nuclear can do is really provide dispatchable energy, which is 24/7. Renewables are intermittent. Clouds pass, sun goes down, wind stops blowing. So you can complement that with batteries, but you can certainly complement it with nuclear, and you can complement it with gas. So rather than an either or, it's both. Because per megawatt hour, and actually the energy you produce, renewables are the cheapest. They just aren't 24/7.
So then to that point, the reliability, the one argument is nuclear and SMRs, small modular reactors, are quote unquote better because they have more reliability, or natural gas has more reliability than for wind or solar. Now you were mentioning you're building this largest solar plus storage with AWS in California. How hard/easy is the storage world right now for you?
Storage is a little bit like a hammer. It has lots and lots of uses.
Okay.
The prices of batteries are coming down a lot. So as the prices of batteries come down, there are more uses that you can find for it. What's interesting about batteries is it can do stuff that, for example, a gas plant or even a nuclear plant can't do. They can go positive and they can go negative. So for example, we have found that when you have a hurricane, having batteries is great because as transmission lines fall down, they were able to suck up that energy and actually allow the fossil plants to gear down and not get damaged. So that's very important. If you compare it to a gas plant, they're online 99.9% of the time. A gas plant will be online 10%, 20% of the time. So I think when there's a lot of excitement like SMRs, the great use I see of SMRs is putting them into retired coal plants. Because basically a big coal plant is just like a kettle. You just change the flame, the heat. So instead of burning coal, you would be heating up the water with a nuclear. So you get to reuse the steam turbines, the interconnection, all those things. The issue I have, with SMRs today is tell me what they cost.
No one knows yet.
And tell me when they're going to be ready. So I believe in the concept. I think they'll be, they could be a game changer. But we really have to see how much they cost, how many we can build before we're going to say that they're going to, significantly displace renewables.
Transport us to one of your boardroom meetings. What types of conversations are you all having right now, especially as we think about power demand?
Well, I think I'm very lucky to have a great board. We do a lot of scenario planning, and we've been doing that for 25 years. So we do scenario planning for regulatory changes, for demand changes. So I think, basically they're quite pleased because about 6 years ago, we really said, look, if you look at people's decarbonization goals, there's going to be a shortage of zero carbon energy. So we built up a pipeline. We bought rights to land. We did interconnection. So, we feel a little bit on the right side of history on these things. So I'd say generally the conversation is very good. So honestly, nuclear is not a main theme, for example, of my board of directors.
Talking about sort of the different projects, what's the hardest part about building stuff right now? Is it labor and materials? Is it getting the PPAs or the offtake agreements? So basically your customer has to sign up and say, okay, I'll pay you this much to get this amount of solar from you. So that gives you clarity on then what you have on your books. What's the hardest part?
The hardest part is getting permitted land.
So none of the things I said. Okay.
None of the things, no. The PPA would be simple. And look, we haven't postponed, forget abandoned, not even postponed a significant project, even during COVID. So I think, we have a very robust supply chain, and we will certainly move everything that's in the U.S. to domestic production by 26. So that is not worrying me. Labor, we've also not had a problem because we've tended to work with strategic contractors in the sense that we don't give them one project. We'll give them a series of projects so they can move the crew from one spot to another.
I see, that's interesting. Do you think permitting is going to get fixed? No matter who's in the White House, how do we fix it?
Look, they say all politics is local, all permitting is local. So, while they've made, let's say, progress, let's say in the way they do interconnections in the states, of batching it, of new ways of thinking about it, I do think that's going to be probably the biggest bottleneck. I think we have to, move renewables to some extent outside of certain areas where there's more resistance. So there's definitely going to be a move to putting renewables where, the permitting is easier, but that's the most difficult.
Can I ask you what kind of shape the grid is in from your perspective?
Boy, how much time do you have?
Look, I think it's a great question, and I'll tell you for the following reason. I think there's a lot of talk about, the shape of the grid, but what we're not doing is fully applying the new technologies we have. So, for example, grids are probably used at 50% of their real capacity. We have a lot of copper sitting around most of the time. So we have the biggest, what's called dynamic line rating project in the US. It's in Indiana. What is dynamic line rating? Very simply, you put sensors on the lines to say what's the actual temperature, what's the actual sag in the lines, what's the wind. And so in some cases, you can actually transmit 50% more energy over it. The second one is that the whole grid is built out for the peak time. The peak time could be 1 hour. The rest of the time, it's underutilized. So by using batteries, we have projects called Grid Booster. You actually transmit the line energy on the off-peak hours. So that I'm not saying it solves everything, but I think we have to think more about these new technologies to make better use of the existing grid.
Before I let you go, what's the one thing that you hope is that investors take away in terms of, say, your stock price? Like, yes, it's recovered, but for the last year, it's still flat or down by about 1%. What do you think it's going to take for you to finally get credit, like Constellation Energy?
Well, I think what people have liked very much about the pure IPP plays is that they think there's little investment. So it's just using existing plants and just recontracting them. In our case, I think, look, we have met or beaten our guidance 8 years in a row. We have grown our dividend 10 years in a row. So I'm, by training, an economist, and I'm just kind of really surprised at some of the correlations in our stock. We're not sensitive to interest rates. So I think those things tend to work themselves out over time. So look, the company's never been better. We're triple investment grade. We have 3 years of construction in our backlog today.
Yep, that's great.
And a lot of very cool new technologies coming on.
All right, Andres, really appreciate it. It's always good to see you. So thoughtful. Andres Glusky, CEO of AES, joining us there. Coming up, we're going to continue the energy conversation. David Doherty is head of oil and renewable fuel research for Bloomberg BNEF. We'll talk to him on the outlook for the market. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Major stock averages slightly higher, and they're above record closes right now. In the S&P 500, you have 8 of the 11 major industry groups. They are up, being led by real estate right now. Most actively traded stock that belongs to Intel as Apollo said to offer a multi-billion-dollar investment. And as Qualcomm also floats a friendly takeover. We have the S&P 500 right now, 18 points higher. That's up 0.3%, 57.21 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 47 points right now. That's up 0.1% at 42,109. And the Nasdaq 100, 81 points higher. That's up 0.4%. The Russell 2000 mid caps and smaller caps, that is 8 points lower right now. That is down about 0.4%. In the meantime, economist Dennis Gartman is shying away from most stocks with an important exception.
The only place that I find that I have any interest in is real estate, because real estate has been so under duress. It has been one of the areas where the public has been not enamored of it.
And as I said, real estate best performing of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 right now. So Oktoberfest officially underway. This year marks the first time an alcohol-free beer garden opened in Munich,
Wait,
Germany.
Oktoberfest is underway in September? I just want to be clear.
Yeah, because there's a lot of drinking to do. So anyway, yeah, alcohol-free beer for the first time in one of the beer tents
So
in
have you
Munich.
had an alcohol-free beer? They're not.
What's the point?
Terrible.
They're not terrible.
I mean, they're not like, yay, but it's not.
But it also costs the same.
It does cost the same.
It does throw you off a little bit, though.
Yeah, but like but it's not all the sugar, right? If you get an alcohol-free drink, it's like, here's all the sugar you could possibly want. It's not that bad.
You sound like you're an advocate for alcohol-free beer.
I don't
and
know.
I have to vigorously oppose your position.
That's a fair point.
Anyway.
All right. Appreciate that, John Tucker. Thank you very much. I'm Alex Steele alongside Norma Linda. Paul Sweeney is not drinking alcohol-free beer in Ireland, but we are here in our Midtown Manhattan studios, our Bloomberg World headquarters in New York. So around this time every day on Monday, we talk to Bloomberg BNEF. They are the leading researchers and everything you need to know about the energy transition. They do work on commodities and power and transport industry, ags. They also talk about finance and governments, and so everyone can make informed decisions on this. And joining us now in studio is David Doherty, head of oil and renewable fuels research for Bloomberg BNEF. David, great to see you. Thanks for joining. But this is Climate Week. So it's all going to be about climate-y, friendly, green things. Does that include your oil and gas?
It does, yeah. You can call oil green things, I suppose, if you want to get exciting about it. We've been talking about alcoholic-free beer, so oil can feature in the climate change transition as well, right?
So that was my way of kind of asking of how does oil and gas play in the energy transition, and what are some of the trends that we've noticed over the last year?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the players in the oil market, they're the energy pros in the world, right? They've got the balance sheet, they've got the skills, they've got the technology, and they're already established, right? So they've got interest in seeing how this develops, how fast it goes, how it impacts their bottom line, basically.
What are the main holdups in terms of the transition? What are some of the headwinds?
I mean, capital is obviously one, raising capital. Smarts, people in the right jobs in the right place, pushback, both political and from people, right? People love the idea, but as soon as it costs money, that's kind of difficult to swallow, especially now in like inflationary times, right?
Is the conversation that EVs will eventually supplant internal combustion engines and get rid of gas demand, is that still something that you guys are working with and modeling, or has that conversation evolved?
It's evolved. I mean, that is kind of the trend, though. Yeah, when you look at things when they're cheaper up front, right, consumers tend to shift towards that. If it's, cheaper day one for buying an EV versus an internal combustion engine car and all else is equal, you're probably going to see a shift towards that, right?
So we're really, though, U.S.-centric here, and we don't see that in the same way. But elsewhere, is that truly what's happening?
Yeah, you are. You're seeing a big uptick in Europe and in China, for example, and even here in the U.S. California, for example, behaves much more like a European economy when we think about the transition to EVs. We've seen really high rates of penetration there.
What are some of the main themes and market dynamics that your team is focused on right now?
Yeah, like the rate of this change is interesting, what's happening in different markets, what the response is. If you take the US, for example, it's a mature market. So when these EVs come into the market, you're seeing a decline in gasoline sales versus, say, in China, where it's like what could have been doesn't necessarily manifest, right? So that turns into then power in your pocket, right? You're seeing the cost of gasoline isn't coming down, even though you're expecting it to with less gasoline being consumed. There's so many more dynamics than just a four wheels on the road situation, right?
And how are all these things impacting the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about costs in your pocket when it comes to driving your car, that's a big thing, particularly here in the US, particularly in an election year. You know, it trickles down into inflation. You get something delivered to your house. The cost of diesel impacts all of these things. So, yeah, consumers are super sensitive of anything to do with cost at the moment. And probably the biggest development here in the US that's been interesting is less consumption of gasoline hasn't turned into less prices at the, a lower price at the pump.
Why do you think that is?
Well, this is key. This is something we have to think about as we go towards transition. If you pull supply in any scenario, you're going to see a price spike. In the US, we're seeing less refinery production than we have a few years ago. So you're seeing over 1 million barrels per day cut in the last 2-3 years alone. And when you have less supply of something, even if you have less demand, it really depends on which one goes first and how speedy that changes.
And so what are people thinking? When will this all shake out?
I mean, it's shaking out already. It's already shaking out in the forecourt when people are buying their car. You're seeing the response from refiners, for example. Some are big refineries like P66 are switching some of their facilities to make things like renewable diesel or sustainable aviation fuel. So people are posturing. Companies are posturing for the next 5, 6, 7 years, right?
Which is such a great point, because I guess the question then becomes, if we're posturing for the 7 or 8 years, what does the landscape in your world look like then? I mean, everyone seems to say it's a yes and. We need everything above all and. Is that how you model it?
That is how we model it, yeah. In our sort of standard outlook, 2029 we see peak oil consumption globally, so that's still pretty far out. There's still a lot of growth left.
Also, peak doesn't mean then that it goes to zero.
Correct.
Like, I feel like that's something we need to also wrap our mind around. Like, just because it's not increasing doesn't mean it's rapidly decreasing.
Yeah, you're totally right. Even in a net zero world in our modeling, you get about 25 million barrels per day of oil. So, net zero doesn't mean zero oil.
So what is the growth outlook here?
You're looking at about 4 or 5 million barrels per day upside in our base case scenario, but lots of things can change that, right? Policies are the main thing to look at, particularly in big markets like the US, right? The US consumes about 1 in every 5 barrels globally. So if something changes here, the whole market can change. The dynamic is really upended.
When we take a look at, say, China and India, large consumers of energy, obviously, are they jumping from coal to what?
Gas is a transition fuel. We're seeing them shift towards. I was just in Beijing last week, and there's a very different way of looking at the oil market versus if you're down in Texas, right? It's what's the displacement, because they need more and more energy, right? They don't want to import that energy, so what can you do domestically? In the case of power, that's coal. But we're also seeing in the case of EVs, right? LNG trucks, even electric trucks. So we have a lot we can learn from them, but they're just very different markets.
And how do they get there? How do they get there? Is it because of subsidies? Is it because they were so dependent on coal? Like, what leads that transition there differently than, say, in the US? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's dependency on imports. They're one example. They've got a lot of national champions. And to be honest, when they say they're going to do something, they do it. In Europe and in the US, you got to get it through parliament. You got to get it through votes. It's a lot slower of a process. And there's less domestic manufacturers. Like Tesla's a big player here, but that's kind of it. In China, you've got a lot of big producers, a lot of big industrial champions, right? And they're encouraged by the states and by the cities and by incentives.
So how do we fit into the bigger international ecosystem?
Well, for the US, one of the most important things is its sort of gasoline production machines. You send a lot of gasoline abroad, South America, Europe even. So there's a change coming along for your US refiners, basically, and you're starting to see how they adjust their positioning in a sort of a market-leading way, I think.
All right, David, we appreciate it. Thank you very much. David Doherty joining us, Head of Oil and Renewables Fuels Research for Bloomberg.
Before you go, have you ever had a non-alcoholic beer?
Oh, bring the Irish guy in. I like this. I have, yeah, and I'm also not averse to it. I'm with Alex on this one. Yeah, I think it's pretty good, especially if you're driving,
Yeah, or just like because some of them you actually can feel the taste. Like non-alcoholic wine is basically like fruit juice, but non-alcoholic beer does taste somewhat like beer.
I agree, and you know what? It stops people asking you, like, why aren't you drinking today? Because they have no idea. It looks the exact same.
Yeah. Well, and
the more you know.
John Tucker? No.
You just all disappoint me.
Oh, so sorry. The alcohol removed wine, though, that's I tried to get into that, and it was like, guys.
What about the hot wine? What's the word for that warm wine?
Stuff? What
cider.
mold stuff? But that's not wine. What?
Is it not?
Bad.
Okay, now we're gonna research this.
This is when I back away.
Is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele here with Norma Linda. Paul Sweeney is off today. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you live from our Actor Broker studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. Right now, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and every day at this time, we are celebrating significant moments in Hispanic heritage. Now, with your installment for September 23rd, here's Bloomberg's Lisa Mateo.
And on this day in 1971, the world of poetry lost a legend. It was Chilean poet, diplomat, and politician Pablo Neruda. Now, that name, it was actually a pseudonym because his family, well, they didn't support his writing career. Now, Neruda, he sold all of his possessions to finance the publication of his first book. It was called Crepusculario, which means twilight. Now, his talent, it later earned him the prestigious Nobel Prize in Literature in 1971. But writing, it wasn't his only passion. Neruda, he also had a long career as a diplomat, various countries. He served a term as a senator for the Chilean Communist Party. But his diplomatic career did come to an end when he resigned as an ambassador to France after he was diagnosed with cancer. That's Today in Hispanic Heritage. I'm Lisa Mateo, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, thanks so much, Lisa Mateo. All right, let's get to a potential strike that we're looking at on the East Coast. Lee Klaskow is Senior Transport Logistics and Shipping Analyst joining us now from Bloomberg Intelligence. He joins us from Princeton, New Jersey. So we have some looming port strikes along major East and Gulf ports. What is the deadline and what do the workers want? How are conversations going?
Yeah, so right as of right now, it seems like the two parties are pretty far apart on a lot of issues. Obviously, there's pay, and then there's obviously work rules. From what we understand is that over the 6-year contract, the union's looking to get a close to an 80% pay raise. Obviously, that sounds like a lot. And there's also some work rules where I'm sure the owners of the ports, which represent pretty much all the major ports up and down the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast, probably want more automation or more flexibility around work rules. The deadline for the contract ends on September 30th, and that means a strike could happen on October 1st. As we get closer to that September 30th date, it seems that a strike is pretty much going to happen. And a strike could last a couple weeks, maybe at the worst, maybe a couple weeks is kind of our outlook as of right now. And that will obviously be very disruptive to supply chains, a net positive for freight rates if you are a capacity owner, if you're a trucker, a provider of intermodal service, or a liner. Obviously not great news if you're a shipper, given the uncertainty and the complexities that a strike could add to your supply chains, not to mention costs.
And what are some of the specific implications of this if they don't meet that September 30th deadline? Has anything of this magnitude happened before?
Well, there have been strikes since 1977, and Biden said that he wasn't going to enact the Taft-Hadley Act, which pretty much forces the two parties into a cooling off period for, I believe, about 80 days. And so the negotiations would continue to happen despite passing the deadline. I think the Biden administration, my personal point of view is that tone might change if a strike lasts more than a week, because at the end of the day, these ports are responsible about 40% of all imports coming into the country, and will have an impact on the economy, which is, it's still, we're seeing growth, but that growth is probably pretty fragile. We don't want to see a recession around the corner. I'm not going to say that this could push us into a recession, but it definitely will be a drag on economic growth.
Do they expect any sort of ripple effect of more strikes, or is this isolated?
It would just be up and down the eastern seaboard and the Gulf Coast, so it won't impact the western ports. You could see some of the western ports maybe slow, the workers slow in solidarity with their brothers in the east, but you wouldn't see other people striking just because of the labor impact on those ports that are directly impacted by these negotiations.
How well is a supply chain insulated in a way that it might not have been, say, 10 years ago, or is this just going to hurt?
Well, the good news is that shippers. A lot of shippers were ahead of this. This has been well telegraphed. We all knew that the September 30th deadline was going to happen. So it's not like new news. And so a lot of shippers were probably diverting their freight to other ports or pulling forward demand into the eastern or Gulf ports ahead of it. So, it's not going to be like an extreme shock to the supply chain. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be another disruption. And as you know, since the pandemic, we've had one disruption after the other, and it's really hard to have a normalized supply chain over the last couple of years. And once they do strike, it's not like once they go back to work, everything's going to be hunky dory. You're going to have backups at the ports because there are going to be a lot of ships that were waiting to unload that just weren't able to unload because of any labor actions.
And quickly, Lee, you mentioned that this was expected. Why wasn't there some sort of proactive resolution or response?
Well, when you have two parties negotiating and they're not in agreement, there's nothing you really can do. I think that the Biden administration would like to see an agreement between the two groups. I would say the labor unions are kind of coming off this kind of high that labor had during the pandemic because of such the tight labor markets. We're in a slightly different market right now, so maybe their negotiating powers aren't as strong as they might have been a year ago.
Hey, Lee, really appreciate it. Thank you so very much, Lee Klaskow.
Thank you.
Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Transport, Logistics, and Shipping Analyst. It's like when I'm negotiating with my 10-year-old. Things just don't work out. All right, Nora, thanks a lot. Pleasure.
Yes.
Wonderful to have you here for the last 2 hours. Coming up, Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Israel continues to pound Lebanon. Will there be a wider war? Welcome to the fastest show in politics following a weekend of hostilities between the two sides, with Israeli airstrikes killing almost 3 people today. And breaking now on the terminal, the U.S. will send additional troops to the Mideast amid the escalation. We're going to talk about this dangerous moment and get the latest from Dan Flatley on our national security team. He'll be here in just a moment. New polling on the presidential campaign brings good news for Donald Trump in both Arizona and Georgia. We're going to talk with Don Levy, the man behind the Siena College Research Institute that generated these numbers, with analysis from our signature panel. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us for the hour on the fastest show in politics. We start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. For that, we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Charlie, how's it going?
Hello there, Joe Matthew. Higher across the board right now. That is where we stand. Just afternoon, East Coast time. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green right now. We got the S&P pushing higher. And right now, we are at 57.17 on the S&P, up by about 0.3%. The Dow higher by 16, little change there. The NASDAQ Composite Index pushing higher again, up another 53, 18,001 right now on NASDAQ, higher by 0.3%. We've got the 10-year at 3.74%, the 2-year 3.58%. Gold now higher by just about $8 the ounce, up 0.3%, 26.29, and a retreat for crude oil today. West Texas Intermediate down 1.3%, 70.07 for a barrel of WTI. Equities climbed, treasuries fell after data showing business activity is robust, even as growth moderates, further stoking confidence that the U.S. economy can nail a soft landing. Well, as for U.S. markets and the election, Ed Yardeni is chief investment strategist at Yardeni Research.
I'm concerned that they're just completely ignoring what's right ahead of us here, which is a presidential election, and either candidate's policies are likely to be inflationary and bloating the deficit again.
Yardeni was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance. Hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Sources tell Bloomberg Apollo Global Management has offered to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in Intel, providing the chip maker with a vote of confidence in its turnaround strategy and an alternative to a potential takeover by larger rival Qualcomm. Right now, we have got Qualcomm down 1.8%, Intel up by 2.8%. So again, recapping here, stocks are higher. S&P right now up 14, up by about 0.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, good to see you, Charlie. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can always find us. Just search Bloomberg Business News Live, and you'll find our live stream with programming coming from Washington and New York all day. This is a big one now. We're going to get to the campaign with new polling numbers, and Don Levy is with us today. Looking forward to the conversation. But we have breaking news coming out of the Middle East right now with 2 important headlines crossing the terminal. Benjamin Netanyahu urging the people of Lebanon, to get out of harm's way now. The Associated Press also with a news alert just a moment ago. The U.S. will send additional troops to the Middle East amid the escalation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Pentagon says. Now, this, of course, follows A very difficult weekend and a series of airstrikes now today by Israel against Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon. Bloomberg reporting 274 people killed. The attacks injured more than 1,000, including women and children, according to Lebanon's health ministry. Israeli medics say 8 people were wounded in northern Israel as a result of Hezbollah's own salvos. And this is where we start our conversation with Dan Flatley, of course, reporting for Bloomberg here in Washington as part of our national security team. Dan, this is feeling like the temperature is still rising after you and I spoke at the end of last week. When you hear a warning like this from Benjamin Netanyahu, what does that indicate the next couple of days might look like?
Well, it certainly indicates that these strikes on Lebanon will continue. We've seen an exchange of rocket fire from both sides, but it's apparent that Israel intends to continue whatever we're going to call this campaign right now that sort of began with these pagers and walkie-talkies and has kind of continued into the foreseeable future. What their ultimate aim seems to be something short of a ground invasion. I think Netanyahu has said that this will be an aerial campaign, at least for the foreseeable future, and whether that is just to basically kind of soften Hezbollah's ability to continue these rocket attacks in order to potentially begin to move some people back into that area on the side of Israel. That could be an outcome here. Although, as you mentioned, we do have some reporting that the U.S. is possibly nervous about things getting a little bit more out of control and sending some troops into the region. But that is kind of textbook for this type of situation. So I wouldn't read too much into that particularly, but it does signal that there is some concern there for sure.
Well, it's interesting you point out wisely. That was a week ago today when pagers started blowing up.
Right.
Walkie-talkies were the next day. We saw an exchange of fire that lasted the balance of the week. And so now here we are on a new Monday, and people are talking about the potential for a wider war, escalation, an all-out war with Hezbollah. Is this not it?
I don't know what that would look like. I'm
you
not
mentioned
sure
the ground invasion. I guess that would be the next level.
We haven't seen something like that since maybe 2006, which I believe was the last time that you saw some really significant fighting there. Certainly, there's always the potential for something like that. And let's not forget that an aerial campaign, while it may sound more technical or anodyne than a ground invasion, still results in casualties, be they of enemy combatants or potentially collateral damage like civilians. So it's not nothing, but whether this would escalate into an all-out war, I don't think we've seen indications of that yet. But it certainly means that things are going to continue to be volatile in this region for a long time to come.
The U.S. posture as we go into UNGA week here remains the same. We will help defend Israel at all costs against these Iranian affiliates. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that is the top line. You start from there. And then there's always a little bit of a difference in administrations in terms of how they, would approach some of the more discrete issues. And I think the Biden administration has largely been characterized by this desire to avoid escalation, desire to avoid an all-out regional war. Israel has its own sort of agenda in mind, and certainly Israel's enemies in the region have their own agenda in mind. So you have to kind of you get a vote in terms of what you're going to do, as a country, but you don't necessarily get a vote as to what your enemy is going to do, or even what your ally is going to do in this situation.
Interesting to see what these conversations bring about over the next few days.
Yeah.
Dan, it's good to see you. Thank you so much. Dan Flatley, look for him on the terminal and online as part of our national security coverage with moment-by-moment updates here coming out of the region. An important story that we've got our eyes on, much like the campaign trail coming off a weekend that saw both the candidates out. They are fanning out again today. Donald Trump in Indiana. You say, why in Indiana? The swing state of Indiana. It's actually a town in Pennsylvania, right between Pittsburgh and Punxsutawney. That's where the former president is today. By the way, Politico reporting that the DNC is trolling Donald Trump with chicken signs across Indiana, Pennsylvania, because he doesn't want to do another debate. J.D. Vance in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tim Walz in New York before going to St. Paul, Minnesota. With new polling out, there's got a lot of people talking today. I'll tell you what, when Don Levy goes in the field, he brings something back every time. And the narrative this morning is, hey, slow down. This whole idea of Kamala Harris catching up with, if not surpassing Donald Trump in the polls, Look at the swing states of Arizona and Georgia. Enter Siena College, New York Times. Donald Trump gaining a lead in Arizona, remains ahead in Georgia with the top lines. We're going to add North Carolina, too. This is going to be a bit of a Sun Belt theme today, all right? Trump 50 in Arizona, Harris 45. In Georgia, Trump 49, Harris 45. In North Carolina, Trump 49, Harris 47. Back with us on Bloomberg, Don Levy, Siena College Research Institute Director. Don, it's great to have you back. This reminds us that each poll is a snapshot, and this is a living, moving organism as we make our way to November, isn't it?
It absolutely is. I mean, voters are enthusiastic. They want to respond to us. And right now, these results certainly are a moment in time, but you can't ignore them. Right now, Trump has pulled ahead by 5 points in Arizona, and it's especially noteworthy because in the very same poll, the Senate race, which I know you follow very closely, Gallego up by 6 over Lake. So an 11-point difference between where Harris stands in Arizona versus where Gallego stands. And what's most important to these voters? They continue that they're worried about the direction of the country. The economy is important. And also really interesting in these 3 polls is where before the issue of protecting democracy was an issue that Harris had an advantage, a 5, 6, 7-point advantage. Right now, who's better at protecting democracy? Trump and Harris are even across each of these 3 key swing states.
Well, you know, part of the narrative when Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden at the top of the ticket, Don, and I'm sure I asked you about this at the time, was a new lane opening across the Sun Belt, that you didn't have to necessarily rely on these old Rust Belt states, the blue wall, because Kamala Harris might have more appeal than Joe Biden in some of these states. We looked at Georgia, we looked at Arizona, and yes, North Carolina, which we were talking about just last week being a problem for Republicans, in part because of this new Mark Robinson scandal. But what do you make of that now when you pull out broadly and look at the potential lanes to victory for these candidates?
Well, certainly the Sun Belt lane is by no means closed for Harris. I mean, you bring up North Carolina. A month ago, we had Harris by 2, during that enthusiasm burst after the Democratic convention. Now we've got Trump by 2, really a dead heat. And I think that you're really right to point out this issue with Mark Robinson. Our polling was ostensibly completed right before that big story broke. And right now in that race, the gubernatorial race in North Carolina, we have Democrat Stein up by 10 points over Robinson. And as I say, that's most of that polling done before the news. So we're looking at a situation in North Carolina where I think the Republicans are going to remain worried about a reverse coattails that maybe could narrow that gap that we see right now between Trump up by 2 over Harris there in the Tar Heel state.
Looking at Arizona as well, a ballot measure codifying the fundamental right to an abortion, as they call it, you find is supported by 58% of the state's likely voters. I don't know if that's reverse or how that works with coattails, but what does that mean for Kamala Harris as an issue that potentially drives the top of the ticket?
It's a winning issue for her. She continues to lead not only in Arizona, but in each and every one of these battleground states when we say who's better on the issue of abortion. Now, you got to remember, though, that there's a difference between voters who say they want abortion to always be legal and voters who say they want it to be mostly legal. There is certainly some erosion away from Harris amongst voters who say that abortion should be mostly legal, where nearly half of those voters actually prefer Donald Trump. So abortion continues to be an important winning issue. Certainly the Harris camp is hopeful that that ballot initiative will bring out voters who might not otherwise vote, younger voters, young women, and that those voters could narrow this current 5-point gap that Harris suffers from there in Arizona.
Really interesting here as both candidates get out in the field this week to again hold major, at least as they're being termed, major policy speeches on the economy. We're going to get them back to back. It looks like Tuesday, Georgia, Donald Trump, Wednesday, Kamala Harris in Pittsburgh. They've both got their own angles here, of course, especially when I shouldn't say, especially when it comes to taxes, because they even have some overlap there with no taxes on tips. What did you find, Don, on this most important issue that we've seen quite a bit of narrowing in the last couple of weeks in other swing state polls?
Well, a couple of things. In the 3 swing states that we just looked at, when we asked voters a simple question, are we headed on the right track or in the wrong direction? By about 2 to 1 in all 3 of these states, voters told us they think the country's headed in the wrong direction. The economy really stands out. When we say, did Trump's policies help you or hurt you? People like you. Trump enjoys a plurality of voters who say that they remember his years, especially the economic component of those years. More fondly, they tend to say that his policies help them rather than hurt them. A small plurality are worried that Harris's economic policies could hurt them more than help them. Trump continues to enjoy in the Sun Belt states a wider margin on who's better in the economy. If we had time, I'm sure we'll talk about it later in the week when we're out with Michigan and Wisconsin again. But in the Rust Belt, that gap over the economy has closed more, and Trump has a much smaller lead in terms of voters' impression of who's better in the economy. I think policy statements this week from both of them could influence those voters in the northern Rust Belt states as well.
Mm-hmm. The undecideds are always a fascination to us here, and 12% of these voters, and check me if I'm reading this incorrectly, 12% of these voters who said they could still change their mind said their biggest concern about Kamala Harris was around her handling of the economy. That's exactly why she's talking this week, right?
Oh, absolutely. She's trying to find that secret sauce. Is it specific policies? Is it an overall feeling? To what degree is she going to distance herself from the Biden administration? She continues to wrestle with how can she convince these undecided voters, many of whom are younger, many of whom have historically leaned more towards Democrats, but who at the same time say the economy is tough for them. In fact, young voters, undecided voters, tell us that the economy is even a greater issue, a greater problem for them than older voters. So Harris has got to keep pounding on how she's going to address the economy for those voters. Right now, Trump continues to enjoy a margin there. And now we add in the situation in the Mideast, and we know from our polling that voters tend to see Trump as being more respected by world leaders than is Harris, and as a stronger leader than Harris. So in a time of global instability, that also tends to give a bit of a nod right now to Trump over Harris.
Okay. Don, I'm out of time. I have like 30 seconds. I'm just curious, do you see evidence in your research that voters want to see more interviews, as we keep hearing with Kamala Harris, that they want more detail in the media by doing town halls and interviews?
Yeah, absolutely. Voters are asking for that. They say by a rate of about 3 to 1 that they're less likely to know enough about Kamala Harris as compared with Trump. They also, in some polls, have told us that they'd like to see another debate. Right now, it doesn't look like we're going to see that. But yes, voters are asking for more information about Vice President Harris.
There you have it from Don Levy, the authority at Siena College Research Institute. Great to have you back, Don. Thank you so much for the insights in a poll that is driving the conversation coming off of this weekend. We're 6 weeks out as of tomorrow. And the fastest show in politics continues with another story we haven't even touched yet, funding the government as we head for a potential shutdown. This is Bloomberg.
industry. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow Industrial swinging between gains and losses. S&P right now trading higher by 8. That is the S&P up 0.2%. The Dow, let's call that flat on the day right now, down by 0.5 point, but swinging between gains and losses on the Dow. S&P, to put it all in context, up 0.2%. NASDAQ right now up 14, a gain of 0.1%. 10-year at 3.74%, with a 2-year 3.57%. Gold is advancing $5 the ounce to $26.27. That is a gain of just about 0.2%. And right now, crude oil, after earlier gains, we got West Texas Intermediate crude oil now slumping by 2%, back below $70 a barrel. WTI 69.61 a barrel. It is not hurting oil stocks, so we got ExxonMobil up 0.8%. BP, the ADR is up 0.2%, and Chevron shares, they are gaining now. Chevron up by 0.5%. So again, recapping, the Dow fluctuating now down by 1 point, S&P up by about 0.1%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to Monday and the fastest show in politics. With news, we've covered geopolitics already this hour. We covered the presidential campaign with Don Levy. We turn to Congress now with another newsy weekend here, and 1 week to go. It's a week from today, right? The government shuts down unless they figure this all out. And we've been told consistently that there will be no government shutdown. So here's plan B. Are you ready? 3-month, we told you this was coming the end of last week. 3-month stopgap, no SAVE Act. It does, however, include extra money for the Secret Service. And this would basically keep things running then, assuming they pass it on time, through December 20th. So we're keeping our Christmas plans on hold. Mike Dorning joins us at the table here in Washington on the stopgap. And I know that you don't see a government shutdown coming, right? Everybody's got to get home to campaign.
Yeah.
So now we're setting up a Christmas shutdown battle, whether we like it or not.
Well, things may change between now and Christmas. I mean, what they just did is what they do every election.
Yeah.
Except for, with some rare exceptions, which have proved to be bad for the parties that have caused the shutdown. Kick it until after the election if you can't agree.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that will happen between now and then is they'll know what the new power structure is going to be. They'll know that who's going to be president, who's going to have how much power in the House, and that may or may not help them come to a better understanding. Because the first things you have to do in Washington is be clear on the power dynamics, and then you can make a deal better.
Okay. Those who had an allergy, though, to a longer stopgap are just going to be asked to sign another one, though, right? We're not going to fund the government and have 12 spending bills in the
of course,
couple days before Christmas. So can't we just get this done now, maybe buy some time until the next president is in office, have a concerted debate? It's just not possible.
Not possible.
Okay.
Because what they're doing is they're taking all the hard decisions where they'd have to compromise, and they're saying, let's have that fight after the election because we don't want to risk a shutdown. Now, it's possible they could just, I don't think they'll do it, but it's possible September 20, they could also kick the can into the next administration. If some of the conservatives wanted to do that in the hopes that Trump would win the election.
Right.
But actually, you're not really doing any newcomer a favor by starting them spending their political capital on a funding battle that's,
fair point,
by that point, like only half a year.
So in the Dear Colleague letter from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, I'm sure he copied you on it, he calls this, quote, a very narrow, bare bones CR, including only the extensions that are absolutely necessary. I read that because that is not what Donald Trump wanted. He said, no SAVE Act, shut it down. And he hasn't changed his tune on that. The SAVE Act, again, would require voters to show proof of citizenship when they register to vote. How much of a problem is the former president going to be then?
So right now, sometimes when he complains about stuff a little bit, they can just ignore him. That's happened in the past in this Congress. But if he really puts his foot down and he's saying he's really pounding them on it, you might see a lot of Republicans break away. One thing this has done, though, is from his standpoint, even just raising this issue and including it in this fight allows him and Republicans to talk to conservative audiences more about immigration.
Okay.
And it keeps immigration a little bit in the news, and American voters, by and large, are more in the Trump world when it comes to immigration than the Harris world.
Let's wonk out hard for a second. This goes to the Rules Committee tonight.
Okay.
Does it clear rules, or do we pass this under suspension of the rules? Rosa DeLauro says that would be the case, and that's a familiar territory for Mike Johnson.
Yeah, now there's 3 hardcore conservatives among the Republicans on the Rules Committee. So if they want to do it through the regular process where it goes to the Rules Committee and it needs a majority vote, those 3 Republicans could stop them if it's a party line vote, but you could also get the Democrats to help you in the Rules Committee, theoretically. I don't know where they are on their current negotiations on that. But at the end of the day, whether they do it through one process or another process, this is for sure going to get voted on, and it will pass the House. The only question is how many Republicans defect and then hold that against the Speaker later.
Well, that's a great question, because it looks like they're aiming for a vote on Wednesday. So should we assume Mike Johnson is sitting down with Hakeem Jeffries as opposed to his own conference right now to see how many Democrats he can get?
He probably is checking with that, but they will probably give him enough.
Yeah.
Because the Democrats have no objection to this. They'd rather do other things.
Sure.
But this is fine with them. They'll just, put everything off for 3 months. The real, perhaps revealing thing here will be if there's a big rift that opens up with the hardcore conservatives getting really mad at Johnson, that could come back to hurt him when he's running for re-election as party leader.
Yes. Right.
And, there's different scenarios. You could be the Republicans could have the majority and they'd need a speaker who could win a majority of the House, or they might not be the majority and they just need someone who wins a majority of Republicans.
Boy, the stakes are high. There's no two ways
high for
about
Mike
it.
Johnson, especially.
Absolutely. And here we go again. Yet no one this time has uttered the words motion to vacate, which have come with every budget standoff preceding him, going back to Kevin McCarthy.
Well, at this point, there's not a lot of upside to vacating him because there's not much of the year left. And if you're a Republican, you don't want to show voters a lot more turmoil.
Well, no, it'd be a terrible look, right? But the Freedom Caucus doesn't seem to be above that with the way they've treated him so far.
They have to have some consideration for the rest of the party. Most of those Freedom Caucus members are in districts where the Republicans are the overwhelming majority. They don't really have to worry about what's going to happen on Election Day in November because they know they'll win. But for other Republicans in the party, they know that would be a terrible look, and they know you don't really get much for it.
Producer James says he misses the MTV. People are nostalgic about it. We talked about it every day, Mike. Now it's gone. I want to ask you about something that's breaking this hour.
Okay.
We don't know a lot about it, but the Associated Press says the Pentagon has approved dispatching additional U.S. troops to the Mideast amid escalations between Israel, Hezbollah, never mind what's already happening in Gaza. A lot of the concern about a long-term CR, as we talk about government funding, came from Pentagon budget hawks, defense hawks. Are we going to have a supplemental budget request for the Pentagon in the lame duck session?
Well, that's more than I know from that
I'm
little
putting you right on the
shred of
spot.
information.
No, forget
that you
those
have.
headlines for a second, though. They're worried about ongoing funding of the Pentagon with multiple hot wars going on across the country. And I wonder, we'll frequently see a disaster relief supplemental pop up.
And they didn't get one for this time.
There you go. Maybe we see something that has military spending also.
It's possible. Now, one thing, it's been a long time since I've wonked out on the Pentagon budget. During the Iraq War, I used to wonk out on it a lot.
You practically lived there.
I did live there a lot in Iraq, but they do have something, or used to have something, called the Contingency Overseas Operations budget, and it used to be quite large, where you could just use that money if you needed to in a crisis like that, and that would probably be enough to get you through for a few months. Now, that assumes that it's a sort of a low level, you need to add some troops, send some Navy ships, some special forces. That's not enough money to pay for, some huge influx of forces.
But a debate that might be had when we start hearing, concern about this going into the beginning of the year. Interesting question. You see that the president's meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Will he have another turn in front of this Congress, or has he fired his last round when it comes to addressing joint sessions? I know a lot of Republicans don't love that idea.
My understanding is Zelensky is going to address Congress.
He will.
I had heard talk of that. I didn't come prepared to talk about.
No, that's fine. I'm pulling you down all kinds of different paths here today, Mike. That says a lot about where we are in this debate, and it makes you wonder if the next president is going to be in a similar situation to Joe Biden, or if the last train is kind of leaving the station here when it comes to funding.
Comes to funding Ukraine.
For Ukraine, yeah.
I think that it will depend a lot on how the election turns out. I think that on the Senate side, the Republicans are not as opposed to funding for Ukraine as on the House side. So if you had, one possibility is a Democratic-controlled House, a Democratic president, and a Republican-controlled Senate, that's a scenario where you could see things working out. You have a Republican-controlled president, a Republican-controlled House, maybe less likely. It's definitely a fear that a lot of people following the Ukraine war have, that it's unclear what, if any, additional support the U.S. might give under a new administration. And it's something a lot of European diplomats have been talking about. How would they handle that scenario?
Well, particularly as things escalate in the Middle East and our attention is more focused on what's happening with Israel, with Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, it's going to be more difficult with time to be heard on another funding package for Ukraine, I suspect, in this Congress.
Yes, also, if things in the Mideast spin out of control, and that's something that the Biden administration for a year has been working very hard to avoid, there's just a question of how much appetite people in America will have for being engaged in so much conflict in the world, separate and apart from the debate over Ukraine. If you start to be asking people to be too involved in these things, people are going to start to maybe resist.
You start wondering why this is not a louder conversation on the campaign trail for these two candidates. Mike, thanks for coming in, as always. Mike Dorning with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll let you know when we get timing on that vote to get back to where we started on the stopgap and where this goes in the Senate. It's going to be an important week when it comes to government funding. Our panel's up next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano right here on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks trading mix a little changed on the Dow right now, down 2 points, down less than 0.1%. S&P up 7, a gain of 0.1%. Equities hedging higher, with NASDAQ now up by just under 0.1%, higher by about 9 points. 10-year at 3.73%. The 2-year yield 3.56%. Gold higher, a little changed, up by about 0.2%. Spot gold now at $26.27. But we are seeing a retreat in crude oil, now down by almost 2%. WTI under $70 a barrel. Crude right now $69.64 a barrel. Bottom line here, stocks trading mixed. S&P up by about 0.1%. Wall Street continues to digest last week's 50 basis point cut by the Federal Reserve. Phil Orlando is chief equity market strategist at Federated Hermes. This morning he told us, given the November election, he thought the Fed would have gone 25.
Historically, the Fed does not like to put its thumb on the scale and tries to avoid the appearance of impropriety during presidential election years. Now, given the tone of the data, in our view, it was absolutely appropriate for the Fed to cut interest rates, but we would have opted for a more conservative quarter-point cut.
Orlando was interviewed on Bloomberg Intelligence, and you can hear more on the Intelligence podcast. Download it wherever you get your podcasts. Constellation Energy is leading power companies higher after its deal with Microsoft being well received by analysts. Constellation Energy extended gains from last week to hit a record. Morgan Stanley raising the target on the biggest operator of nuclear reactors after the company said it would invest $1.6 billion to revive its 3 Mile Island plant. We've got Constellation Energy up 0.5%, Microsoft down by 0.2%. So again, S&P up by about 0.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Watching the markets for us every day here on the fastest show in politics. Thanks for beginning your week with us here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Awash in numbers, much like Charlie, but not on the markets, on politics. A bunch of polls released over the weekend, all of them making news in their own way. We spoke earlier with Don Levy at the New York Times Siena College poll, but NBC News was out as well, a national poll, Harris with a 5-point lead over Trump, and that's among registered voters, so it's one that we're a little bit less excited about, but it includes a couple of interesting points. A 16-point jump in Kamala Harris's favorability since July. Has that ever happened before? Also, on the issues, and when I say that, I mean the biggest one, the economy. They did break down the numbers on a lot of issues, but this is the one that we're obsessed with. Trump leads Harris on dealing with the economy, 50% to 41%, a 9-point gap, and on dealing with inflation and the cost of living, almost as wide, 48 to 40%, an 8-point gap. But it's the states that we're obsessed with. That's why we wanted to talk with Don Levy earlier, and I want to hear from our panel on these as well. Remembering, New York Times Siena finds Trump gaining a lead in Arizona, holding a lead in Georgia, and looking at a very narrow lead in North Carolina, where, of course, the landscape has changed since these polls came in from the field. Just ask Mark Robinson, whose entire senior staff quit last night. They're back together today, I'm glad to say. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. Of course, Jeannie, Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, Political Science Professor at Iona University, and Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. They are both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, I'm going to start with you as our polling expert here and your thoughts on New York Times Siena. These 3 states, when you look at Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, maybe North Carolina is a little noisy right now, to be counted on here for a number like this. But is it calling into question this idea of a new lane for Kamala Harris in the Sun Belt?
Well, I agree with your description, Joe. We are awash in poll numbers. It's that time of the year. And I think we have to be a little bit circumspect. So I think the rule of thumb, and you talked to Don Levy about this, number one, we need to look at the timing of when these polls were fielded. That's going to be critically important. Response rates. and also to take them in conjunction with each other. So to look at these polling averages. And I think when you do that, you see, some good news on both sides. Certainly Donald Trump's going to welcome this New York Times Siena poll. That said, there's also good news on the Harris side as you look at NBC. So I think the big takeaway, if you look 30,000 feet, is this race is still on a razor's edge. There is still all of these, or many of these good polls are within a margin of error in these swing states. So it's hard to look at one and discount another when you look at them and you look at those averages together.
Rick, I'd love your take on these. I suspect you see it a lot like Jeannie does here in terms of how close this race is. I want your take on North Carolina, and we'll get there on this whole Mark Robinson saga. But did we learn anything new in these polls?
It's hard for me to tell. I agree with Jeannie. I mean, it's hard to take one in isolation, but the overall picture is super tight race, looks just like 2020 at this point in the race. So I suspect the outcomes are going to be similar. 10,000 votes in Arizona. Arizona is the one I think is standing out. Harris was up 5 in their last poll. There has not been a 15-point swing in Arizona where the Democrat running for the Senate holds a 6-point lead above the Republican. I mean, those things don't fit. So there's something going on. I mean, they take all registered voters, not just likely voters. Maybe that's part of it. But that's a flashing yellow sign to me that there's something going on in that Arizona survey that does make sense. But the others do. I mean, they're just like basically where they were in the previous poll. And we just haven't seen any movement in this entire campaign that you would call dramatic. And yet you've had some incredibly dramatic events that have occurred in this campaign. And so everything I'm seeing in all the state polls, including the North Carolina poll here in Georgia, is that Kamala Harris has picked up some momentum against not just the ballot, but in her perception by the public and her capability on issues of governance and trust. So, my guess is we're going to have a squeaker this time around, just like we did in 2020.
Yeah. Jeannie, what do you make of this favorability number for Kamala Harris in the NBC News poll? As I mentioned, a 16-point jump since July. They call it the largest increase for any politician in the history of NBC News polling since then-President George W. Bush after 9/11. Is this as simple as replacing Joe Biden at the top of the ticket?
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. Rick was just talking about we've seen so many dramatic events and polling has changed comparably very little, that you have to go back to 9/11 to see a swing like this. When I look at this, I think it is a reflection of the fact that before Joe Biden dropped out of the race really was a referendum on Joe Biden, on the Biden administration, particularly Biden economic policies. Since Kamala Harris took over, it has become less of that and more of a referendum on Donald Trump to a certain extent as people try to get to know Kamala Harris. So when you look at a favorable swing, and it is remarkable to this degree, to me, it says that voters have come home, Democrats and maybe some moderate Democrats, to the Democratic side who were really never Joe Biden voters now that they have somebody new on the ticket. But there's still an awful lot to learn for these voters about Kamala Harris, particularly as it pertains to the economy. And that's why I think we're seeing, a week that looks like it's going to be a policy economy focused week, because voters are really hungering to know, what is she going to do for me that's different than Joe Biden?
Rick, what's going on in North Carolina? As we mentioned, a razor-thin lead for Donald Trump. They're statistically tied here, knowing that the Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, is in some real trouble here politically. We talked about the scandal as what he was doing, trolling this porn site last week, according to CNN. He still says it's not true, but his entire senior campaign staff quit over the weekend. He is now left with 3 people working for the campaign, Rick. One of them is his bodyguard. Can the Lieutenant Governor, who is already losing this race in the polls, lose the whole state for Donald Trump?
It's a good question, Joe. As you point out, you've now got clear sailing for a Democratic governor to win in North Carolina, which has become the norm now. And it is going to definitely make Donald Trump's ascension to victory in North Carolina harder. He's had a lot of problems in North Carolina. I mean, for being such a reliably Republican state, he's really having a lot of trouble. They don't have any kind of campaign staff, the Trump campaign in North Carolina, and they're relying on Elon Musk's super PAC to identify the vote and turn it out. And so it's kind of a mishmash of the party's broken, the candidate for governor's broken, they're contracting out their ground game. And now Donald Trump probably is looking at, if I need to win North Carolina, I'm going to have to spend a lot more time there being able to overcome this scandal with Mark Robinson than I otherwise would have. And I'd been able to spend time in Pennsylvania or, Georgia or some other state that might be more competitive for him.
Well, Donald Trump did not mention Mark Robinson when he was in North Carolina. Robinson was not invited to his rally on Saturday night, Jeannie, and he never mentioned his name, even though he has endorsed him and has called him Martin Luther King Jr. on steroids. One thing he did talk about was women. And Donald Trump prefaced his speech with a post on Truth Social that is in all caps, and it's so long I can't read the whole thing for you here. You likely have seen it. By the way, this dropped September 20th at 11:42 p.m. Eastern Time. Women are poorer than they were 4 years ago, he writes, are less healthy than they were 4 years ago, are less safe on the streets than they were 4 years ago, are more depressed and unhappy than they were 4 years ago, and are less optimistic and confident in the future than they were 4 years ago. I will fix all of that and fast. And he repeated this passage, we're not even halfway through it here, during his rally behind the plexi, the bulletproof glass in North Carolina. Let's listen.
So let's talk about our great women. Women have gone through a lot. They've gone through a lot. Women are poorer than they were 4 years ago, are less healthy than they were 4 years ago, are less safe on the streets than they were 4 years ago. I will fix all of that, women. I will fix all of that, and I will fix it fast. And at long last, this national nightmare that we're going through will be over. Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion because it is now where it always had to be, with the states and with the vote of the people.
Jeannie, you will no longer be thinking about abortion. This was really quite a statement here. I don't know if you would call this mansplaining, but in an effort to win over suburban voters, is this the strategy to tell them how they feel? To tell them how much money they have? To tell them how they're going to feel after he gets elected?
Yeah, it's not like any communication strategy I've ever heard of to tell people not to think about something that the polls tell us they are clearly thinking about in the case of abortion. But, speaking of the polls, Donald Trump is reading the polls clearly, and he sees what we all see, which is a 21-point advantage for Kamala Harris among women. He has about a 12-point advantage amongst men. That's a problem for him. So, maybe they want to rethink Hulk Hogan ripping his, shirt off at the RNC when they doubled down on men, because the numbers among women are not good. He knows it. And he has decided the way to handle that is to tell all of us women that we don't even need to think about that pesky issue of abortion because he's got it in the bag. So I don't see it as being effective, but he is doubling down on it. A very strange communication strategy if I ever heard one.
He goes on to write, I will protect women at a level never seen before. They will finally be healthy, hopeful, safe, and secure. Their lives will be happy, beautiful, and great again. Rick, I've only got about 30 seconds. Is that a strategy he should continue?
Yeah, no, I'm shocked that Sally Wiles would let that get into the teleprompter. He was clearly reading off the teleprompter when he said it. Not the kind of thing we've ever heard from him before. And I guess they think that, like their MAGA base, if he tells them it's true, it must be true. It's just that he doesn't have that confidence with women voters, nor with suburban women voters. So I think the sell's got to be a little stronger.
Fascinating, as always. I'm glad you're back together. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, they're back in our second hour as we welcome our global television audience and bring Kaylee Lyons into the fold here on the fastest show in politics. We've got a lot more to talk about right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Just 1 week to a possible government shutdown. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the Speaker of the House unveils Plan B. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. The Plan B will sound familiar if you watch Balance of Power, a 3-month stopgap. Kaylee, it's got extra money for the Secret Service. I guess that's new. And it does not include the SAVE Act, which could be a problem for Donald Trump here, but it's likely setting us up for a big budget standoff this Christmas. Are you ready?
Well, I think we all have to be ready. Unfortunately, the holidays will bring with it a spending fight, as this continuing resolution will only go until December 20th. That is, of course, assuming that it passes both chambers of Congress. It likely will. It's just a question of how. The Rules Committee in the House, which includes 3 hardline conservatives, will take it up later today. And if they decide not to pass it out of the committee, then it will have to be under suspension of the rules.
That's right. We could see votes as soon as Wednesday. Something tells me it's a working weekend, but we'll get back to you on that. We're going to talk to Billy House, who covers Congress for us here at Bloomberg. And a little bit later on, we'll do the campaign trail, of course. A lot of new polling out over the weekend. Kaylee and Laura Brown's going to be with us, a political scientist with always an interesting insight.
Yeah, indeed. As we look at the national landscape, in which new polling suggests Harris has pulled ahead nationally, at least per the NBC poll. But when you look at the swing states, the battlegrounds that will actually decide the election, the picture is a little more fuzzy, especially in the Sun Belt, where new polling for the New York Times in Siena has him in the lead across the 3 states. So we're going to have much more ahead this hour. But first, as always, we begin on this Monday, the start of the trading week, with Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee. Indeed, we've got NASDAQ just turning lower right now, as is the Dow Jones Industrial Average. S&P 500 index holding on to a gain, barely up just under 0.1%. Equities paired earlier gains. Treasury yields fell as traders combed through commentary from Fed policymakers for clues on the scope for further easing after last week's half-point interest rate cut. So here's where we stand. S&P, let's call that flat on the day now, up by 2 points, little change there. The Dow dropping 17, down less than 0.1%. NASDAQ now falling by 8 points, a decline there of just under 0.1%. 10-year yield 3.73%, with the 2-year 3.57%. We've got spot gold up $6 the ounce, up by about 0.2%. On a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude, under $70 a barrel, $69.99 right now, a drop there of 1.4%. Sources tell Bloomberg Apollo Global Management has offered to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in Intel, providing the chipmaker with a vote of confidence in its turnaround strategy and an alternative to a potential takeover by larger rival Qualcomm. Intel shares today, they are advancing by 3%. Qualcomm shares down 2.1%. Again, recapping here, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow and both the NASDAQ lower. We have got the S&P little changed, up just under 0.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. Meantime, here in Washington, we have arrived at the moment where we all expected we would eventually get in Congress's funding battle as they race to avert a government shutdown after funding expires on September 30th. Remember the first attempt by Mike Johnson to pass a 6-month continuing resolution with the SAVE Act attached, making illegal something that already is non-citizens voting in U.S. elections, went down on the floor. He has come back with Plan B that initially, Joe, he said he didn't have. There was no Plan B.
Right.
But it's basically what the Senate was looking for, a 3-month
I'm pretty
funding
sure Chuck Schumer
extension.
told him what it was.
And there we go.
Okay, so we're waiting to hear from Donald Trump, right, to see if he likes this or not. No depth charge yet on this plan. Could pass as soon as Wednesday, assuming Speaker Johnson has the Democrats to make this happen. Billy House is covering this for us, of course, at Bloomberg, our congressional correspondent. A rare treat to have him at the desk here. Great to see you in the Bureau. Of course, Billy House lives on Capitol Hill.
That's
Somehow
right.
we pulled him back in the middle of what is a pretty busy week here. You know I want to be a wise guy and ask you, why no ladder? We're just one date here. We're making it so simple. What happened to the laddered CR that Mike Johnson invented earlier this year?
Well, he can't get a simple CR pass.
Isn't that
how
true?
A multifaceted ladder CR would ever work. But, and again, you were right. We are waiting for the president to weigh in. That's the other wrinkle. You might say, could be blamed for the failure of not just one attempt. Remember, Mike Johnson earlier had to pull the bill he had fashioned because he knew it was going to go down to defeat. Inexplicably, he put that bill on the floor anyway, and 14 Republicans voted against it. So here we are with you can say it's simplified, but it's also shorter, and that alone, a December expiration for his SNU proposal, is upsetting other Republicans.
Well, and as we consider former President Trump's response here, he, of course, had originally said no Republican should sign on to a CR of any duration if it doesn't include vote election security measures, the SAVE Act, of course, specifically. He hasn't specifically on True Social addressed this new continuing resolution that was put out, but he did just put out a lengthy post about how Democrats are getting ready to cheat in the elections, in part for not checking citizenship or verification of identity whatsoever. Again, it is already illegal for those who are not U.S. citizens to vote in the elections. But I do wonder the power Donald Trump has over Congress at this point, this close to an election cycle in which not just he is campaigning for victory. Are they likely to care as much as they have earlier in this session?
They do care, but it's going to come down to who they care most about, him or themselves, right? So first of all, you might want to say about the Trump comments, he could be preparing a defense argument for why he lost before the fact, if that happens. But more generally for House Republicans, they have got to realize, and they are realizing, if they shut down government here in the stretch run of a campaign, not only were their goal of keeping the House majority, which is a slim majority, perhaps be hampered or even damaged, their own home elections, their own ability to keep their seats for some of them, especially in those swing districts, and there's like 30 of them, could be in real jeopardy.
One thing that is in this plan that we've not seen in prior versions is more money for the Secret Service, which is a big story that we've been talking about a lot. And you've been present for the debate. There are some in Congress who believe this is not a matter of money, this is a matter of management. Does this get through the final version?
That's exactly the fact. Is it more money throwing that at the Secret Service going to resolve any perceived problems or problems that have been uncovered? Or is it just going to, or will it help? Or is this just kind of a bone to Trump that, for taking the SAVE Act away?
Doesn't jeopardize its chances of passing, though, it sounds like. People will vote for this.
No, people will vote for that.
So then we fast forward to December 20th, where we risk doing the song and dance all over again in the lame duck session, knowing as well that once we get into 2025, we're going to be in a renewed debt ceiling fight too, Billy. Is there a chance that all of that gets wrapped up into one package at the end of the year?
Very difficult to say so because, as I said, some conservative Republicans, for instance, Tom Massey, has always considered and predicted this would happen, a late December deadline for some other action, which they liken to hostage taking. Lawmakers wanting to go home for Christmas, wanting to be with their families, and that's when a Christmas tree effect begins to occur on any late year ban. So that both could help it pass or could help solidify opposition. It's hard to tell at this point.
All right, Billy House, our congressional guru here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. Nice to see you in studio. I'm sure he's going to be rushing back to the Hill.
Yes, we need Billy on that wall.
Yes,
especially
indeed.
this week.
Yes, indeed, we do, as we wait to see if Congress can get this done, knowing that, as we were just discussing with Billy, they're doing it with another deadline in mind, not just the funding one, but November 5th, the day that many of them are trying to hold on to their seats. And it raises the question of the kind of landscape we are seeing across the board, not just for these down ballot races, but for those at the top of the ticket as well, because there's been a ton of new polling out in the presidential race.
That's for sure. You mentioned it earlier, some concerns, I guess we could use that word, for the Harris campaign in the Sun Belt. The fact of the matter is, even while we see Donald Trump carve out a lead in Arizona and maintain a lead in Georgia, this is still so close. When you put this together with the NBC poll from over the weekend, CBS, Ipsos, this thing is still too close to call, even when you get down on the swing state level. I do find it interesting, though, that some of the sunlight we see between these two candidates on the issue of the economy that was borne out in several of these polls.
Well, and we're going to be hearing more from them on the economy, perhaps not a coincidence this week, as they will be giving speeches in separate events this week. So we turn now, as we assess all of this latest polling, to Dr. Lara Brown. She's political scientist and author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character, and the Question of Leadership. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Lara. Always great to have you. If we could just begin with the New York Times Siena Sun Belt polls. Yes, Donald Trump up by 5 in Arizona, 4 in Georgia, just 2 in North Carolina. Those latter two, it's within the margin of error. But what was noteworthy to me is in this poll, about 15% of the electorate in these 3 states described themselves as undecided or not definitely decided. How much room really is there for minds to change here?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily minds to change. It's really a resolve to vote. I do think there is and has been for a long time with Donald Trump on the ballot, a group of voters who are displeased with him as a candidate, but are not sold on voting for a Democrat. And so some of what happens is these people who say they want to vote but say they're undecided are often just unresolved to turn out at all. And I think that's where there can be some persuasion efforts to get people to the polls, and things could change on election day depending on who really does show up.
Interesting numbers on the economy, Laura. I'll point to the NBC News poll here with Donald Trump leading Kamala Harris 50 to 41%, 9 points on the economy at large, and on dealing with inflation and the cost of living, an 8-point lead, 48 to 40%. They're both candidates holding economic policy speeches this week in which they'll try to round out their approach to taxes and incentives. But I wonder, can Kamala Harris win this election without turning these numbers around?
Well, I think she doesn't need to completely turn them around, but she needs to narrow that gap. The reality is she's already cut that gap in half since she's been in the race. When you look at the other polls from June prior to Biden stepping away from the race, Donald Trump was leading by 20 points on that issue. So I do think there has been kind of a return to a sense that the economy is getting better, but not enough people yet feel the impacts of that restoration. And so many individuals are still suffering under the high prices that we experienced with the really unprecedented inflation in the last few years.
Well, of course, Laura, in that regard, we got some big news last week in the form of a Fed rate cut. It is the only one we'll get prior to voters actually going to the polls, though they could very well cut rates again just 2 days after the election. How much do you think that really influences at least the sentiment of the voter and consumer, knowing that rates are lower? Perhaps it's easier to buy a home or a car, buy things essentially that require debt. Does that make a material difference? And when will we see that show up in polls if it does?
Well, I think if it's going to show up in polls, it probably won't show up until late October, partly because where most Americans will see it the fastest is actually in their credit card statements, where they see the changed interest rate that was applied to their revolving debt. So yes, many Americans are now kind of looking at home ownership, and we could see that as rates came down in anticipation of this cut, mortgage rates fell kind of in unison. And I do think more people are thinking about housing changes, but my guess is a lot of that will wait until after the first of the year, and it may not arrive in time for the Democrats at this election.
Laura, I'm curious your thoughts on Donald Trump's approach to women over the weekend, not only on Truth Social, but in person at a rally that he held in North Carolina, knowing that it will likely be suburban women who choose or who decide this election. It's a very long post on Truth Social in all caps. I won't spend time reading the whole thing, but he says, "I will protect women at a level never seen before. They will finally be healthy, hopeful, safe, and secure. Their lives will be happy, beautiful, and great again." He prefaced that by talking about current conditions for women in America, and he read directly from his post in North Carolina. Here he is.
So let's talk about our great women. Women have gone through a lot. They've gone through a lot. Women are poorer than they were 4 years ago, are less healthy than they were 4 years ago, are less safe on the streets than they were 4 years ago. I will fix all of that, women. I will fix all of that, and I will fix it fast. And at long last, this national nightmare that we're going through will be over. Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion, because it is now where it always had to be, with the states and with the vote of the people.
You will no longer be thinking about abortion. I saw a lot of references on Twitter over the weekend to mansplaining. Laura, I wonder what you think about this direct appeal by Donald Trump to women voters.
Well, I think that Donald Trump has very little credibility among many women in America. And in fact, the historic gender gaps that we are seeing in the polling is not only sort of there and present, but if we go back to 2016 and we remember his election and then we remember his inauguration in 2017, there was a giant women's march the very next day. The Sunday after he was inaugurated was the largest march on Washington and really women's march around the country. So I don't think it is credible. It's also in direct contradiction to some of the comments that have been made by either Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance, former President Donald Trump himself with his Access Hollywood tape and the things he has said about E. Jean Carroll and Stormy Daniels. And then, of course, you get to North Carolina itself, where the Republican gubernatorial nominee has been not just revealed as sort of making misogynistic statements toward women, but has himself been caught up in a scandal involving pornography.
Yep, and Mark Robinson has lost now 4 senior members of his campaign staff. He didn't get much from Donald Trump in terms of airtime in North Carolina this weekend, though. He, of course, wasn't there at the rally. Donald Trump didn't address it. How do you actually consider Mark Robinson being on the ballot with Donald Trump, Laura, and looking at the polling in which Trump, according to New York Times Siena, is just 2 points ahead of Harris in a race this tight? Does that kind of candidate actually make the difference?
Well, certainly Mitch McConnell talked about in a prior cycle how important candidate quality is for turnout, for a ballot, for a party to really coalesce and engage and enthusiastically vote for their candidates. So I do think that Mark Robinson is a problem for the Republicans. I think the bigger problem is that North Carolina, like Florida and like Texas, also have very stringent state-level restrictions on abortion. And that is impacting women in those states in a disproportionate way, in a way it's not hitting or impacting women in Michigan or Pennsylvania. So I think we have to be very cognizant of how abortion in those states could actually play to the detriment of Republicans much more than in other places in the country.
Recurring theme in our conversations lately. Dr. Laura Brown, political scientist. Laura, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg. Thanks for a great conversation, as always. As we follow the polling data, and Kaylee, we follow the money as well. With our panel next, we find Kamala Harris outspending Donald Trump to the tune of $5 million a day. Rick and Jeannie up next on Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got stocks pairing gains, still higher now across the board with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing. Treasury yields fell as traders combed through commentary from various Fed policymakers for clues about the scope for further easing after last week's half-point rate cut. Here's where we stand. S&P higher by about 8 points, now up by 0.1%. The Dow up 25, higher by 0.1% as well. And NASDAQ, little changed, up 9 points, up just under 0.1%. 10-year at 3.73%, with a 2-year now yielding 3.56%. Spot gold up $6 the ounce to $26.28, up by 0.2%. But a retreat for crude oil today. West Texas Intermediate crude now down 0.9%, $70.34 now for a barrel of WTI. Biohaven shares are surging after its experimental drug slowed the progress of a rare nerve disease in a study, which the company will be using to seek U.S. approval later on this year. Biohaven shares, based in New Haven, Connecticut. Biohaven up now by 12%. Recapping, S&P little changed, up by 7 points, a gain of 0.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Charlie Pellet there, just throwing some numbers at you that you need to know. And I'm going to do some more. The latest figures assembled by our colleague Bill Allison, according to federal campaign filings, in terms of spending for both of the presidential campaigns. Kamala Harris spending an average of $7.5 million a day in August. That's nearly $5 million more than Donald Trump, who spent $2.6 million on average. You look ahead into September, she's spending $152 million on advertising this month, according to Ad Impact. That's a 21% increase to August, and it's more than double the $63 million that Trump is spending. If it's a money race, Joe, it's an interesting one.
And we know who's winning the money race. But what is the value of money in this race is a question we've asked a lot, certainly when you're running against the king of earned media. And so we assemble our panel for their take on this. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are back with us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Of course, Jeannie's a political science professor at Iona University. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Great to see you both here. Rick, your thoughts on this? Having run a presidential campaign, you know the value of a dollar. But if you're running against Donald Trump, is it a different question?
Yeah, first, you're absolutely right. He is the king of earned media. When he speaks, the media reports it. Even when they know they shouldn't, they do it anyway. And so he gets an enormous advantage with that. But he also doesn't control what is said about him on earned media, and he doesn't always, sort of stick to a message. So he kind of diminishes his own impact through earned media, which means probably advantage Kamala Harris because she's outspending him on the airwaves where 80% of the campaign budget's being used, and significantly so, to the point of 4, sometimes 5 times more money on TV in key targeted swing states than Donald Trump's using. And so I still think a prepared message over and over and over, to voters is going to win out in the long run if the issue is education of the voters.
Okay, so if that's true, Jeannie, why, if Kamala Harris has already been spending that kind of money trying to hit the same messages home, are we not seeing it necessarily show up materially in polls, which still show this is a neck-and-neck race? There has been no serious Harris breakout, at least consistently.
There hasn't been a breakout, but she is up a lot from where Joe Biden was when she took over. You just look at the issue of the economy. Donald Trump is still leading by about +9 in the latest polls, but that is a far cry from where he was leading in the double digits over Joe Biden. So she has seen some movement, and I would suggest some of that movement is coming from the money that you're talking about, because she has been able to use digital to micro-target. She's spending 5 to 1 over Trump on micro-targeting, and that has resulted in gains among some key constituencies. That said, Kaylee, you're absolutely right. for all the spending, she is not running away with the polls either. So, she's sort of back to where we were 2020. She's made the race, more of a dead heat, certainly than where it was when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket. But it is a struggle nonetheless, because Donald Trump is able to do a lot with a little bit of money that he is able and willing to spend on the campaign.
Our story refers to the rapid inflow of checks from deep-pocketed donors to Harris's campaign since she replaced Joe Biden. And there's a fascinating story from over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal I want to ask you both about Harris's undercover push to win over corporate America. Remembering she's been publicly appealing to small businesses and to consumers. But look at this. In the 10 days before Joe Biden dropped out of the campaign, he got about $91,000 from about 990 donors with self-identified CEO titles. In the 10 days after, Harris's campaign received nearly $2 million from 5,000 such donors. There are stories, Rick, about Harris hosting dinners at the Naval Observatory with 8 to 10 chief executives on the regular, talking about a range of topics. This is about more than Mark Cuban. And I wonder, Rick, how important these relationships that she's developing will be to the end result of this campaign.
Well, fundamentally, they result in campaign contributions. And so if you believe what I believe, which is having more money to spend on TV and organizationally and on the ground is an advantage for you, even in a severely divided country like what we have, then that's worth it. Two, there is a follow-on impact of having corporate CEOs and business leadership endorse you and be for you. Lots of employees in places like J.P. Morgan and Citibank and places like that, if they think their bosses are signed on to your philosophy and believe you're good for their company, they'll be more likely to vote for you. It is a fantastic way to try and garner votes. There are tens of thousands of finance employees in Arizona alone that could shift the outcome of that election if they voted their company logo. So the reality is it has a lot of follow-on consequences, and the Republican Party has not really done much to reach out. We've become sort of the party of anti-corporate behavior, and I think that has given an opportunity for the Democrats to exploit it.
Well, Jeannie, it raises the question, though, if there is an opportunity to be exploited, why not be more forward about it? The operative word in this Wall Street Journal headline that Joe mentioned is that this is an undercover push. Is that because this also could risk backfiring among more liberal Democrats?
Yeah, I think Democrats have long had that concern. If you go back to 2016, Hillary Clinton's speeches got a lot of coverage. Some say it hurt her in the populist realm, and that's part of why somebody like Bernie Sanders was so popular in the Democratic primaries and caucuses. So I think there is still some of that concern amongst Democrats out there. I don't know how private I would agree with the Wall Street Journal that these really were. I mean, these are, in many cases, easy to find publicly that she has been doing this. And let's face it, people are going to follow the trends. So when Kamala Harris takes the head of the party and finally gets the nomination, CEOs, people on Wall Street, they too are reading these polls. They see the momentum and they don't want to be left out of a swing towards Kamala Harris. So, I think it's a reflection of the amount of attention and momentum she's had on her side. And, that energy is going to drive money, and it's certainly driven money towards Kamala Harris. I'm not convinced yet it's not a drag on her, but I'm not convinced yet it's going to turn into votes that she needs, but it certainly doesn't hurt her. It's a help, to say the least.
Well, we're having this conversation as the two running mates prepare for their big debate next week. Of course, a lot of things are happening at once here, and it's really interesting to see this come together. We understand Pete Buttigieg has been playing J.D. Vance for Tim Walz in his preparations. Now the New York Times says Representative Tom Emmer, Majority Whip in the House, is playing Tim Walz in J.D. Vance's preparations. They've been doing a lot of these, Rick, at J.D. Vance's house apparently in Cincinnati. It's inside his home and in online sessions to get ready. What's the most important thing Tom Emmer can teach J.D. Vance in the next week?
Yeah, I think J.D. Vance has got a personality problem, right? I mean, Tim Walz is a very friendly, soft-spoken guy who can get excited and spin a phrase, and has, dubbed J.D. Vance weird, which caught on pretty hard. And that's a hard thing to guard against. You can guard against an attack on taxes or an attack on foreign policy, and you can get all the political stuff right. And then all of a sudden, the personality clash, and you look mean, or you look weird, or you look somehow disconnected. And I think that's the biggest, concern. I think if I were in the debate prep with J.D. Vance is like, we got to make you equally normal as Tim Walz. So be careful what you say and how you say it.
Well, and of course, we know we will get this debate next Tuesday. We don't know if we'll get another debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, although Harris over the weekend said she has agreed to another debate on CNN on October 23rd, challenging Donald Trump to do the same, although he has said this weekend that it's too late. The voting is already cast if it happens on October 23rd. Jeannie, if you're a betting woman, are you betting that Donald Trump actually changes his mind and joins her on that stage?
I'm hoping, you know that, Kaylee. I'm really hoping. I think it's very possible. I think if the polls don't look like they are in Donald Trump's favor, he will change his mind without blinking an eye. And the late aspect of this is a bit head scratching because 4 years ago, the debate was October 22nd. So the idea that October 23rd is too late, it's not actually reflective of reality. He did it last time. He could do it again. And he will if strategically it's to his benefit. And of course, Kamala Harris jumping on CNN because she doesn't want to be outfoxed, no pun intended, and have Donald Trump ask her for one on Fox. So there you go. It's all in the game.
Well done, Jeannie. That was pretty good. Rick, do you do an empty chair debate if you're Kamala Harris and you have an opportunity, a network wants to give you an hour, you take it, right?
Yeah, you take the hour as a regular interview that's been done before. You don't have the empty chair, but you get an hour of free airtime. And that close to the election, that's golden. That's a lot of money would have to be spent to buy that airtime. So I think that she ought to try and keep the heat on. I love debates late in the game. This thing needs a change. We need some excitement in this campaign. We just haven't had enough. And look, if Donald Trump thinks the week before that he has a problem and needs to cure it, and the only way to do it is a debate, yeah, he'll show up. He has absolutely no shame whatsoever. We should have learned that by now. So, hold your breath and maybe we'll have another clash of the Titans.
All right. Holding our breath indeed. Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of the Center for the Study of Democracy and Congress. Thank you. Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency.
It's a big business card. I don't know.
It's Monday. Yeah. We appreciate our signature political panel as always. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we're all going to be together in New York next week for that vice presidential debate.
Special coverage. Let's take them one at a time. Rick and Jeannie will certainly be there. We'll have that debate for you right here on Bloomberg. A lot more ahead on Balance of Power, the Monday edition. Stay with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing as traders comb through commentary from Fed policymakers for clues about the scope of further easing after last week's half-point cut. So here's where we stand. S&P now up by 10 points, up by just about 0.2%. The Dow has spent a lot of the day fluctuating. Right now, the Dow is up 54 points, higher by 0.1%, and NASDAQ is up 14 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, again right now of just about 0.1%. 10-year at 3.73%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.56%. Gold up $6.50 the ounce, up 0.3% right now, 26.28 on gold. While West Texas Intermediate crude 70.35 a barrel, was trading below 70 a few minutes ago. Right now we have got West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%. Constellation Energy shares higher, little change right now after its deal with Microsoft is being well received by analysts. Constellation Energy extending gains from last week at a record. Morgan Stanley raising the target on the biggest American operator of nuclear reactors after the company said it would invest $1.6 billion to revive its 3 Mile Island plant. Constellation up now by just about 0.1%. Microsoft trading lower by 0.3%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much on the Monday edition of Balance of Power with his eyes on the markets for us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Limes in Washington, and glad you're with us here as we count down to a possible government shutdown a week from today. And of course, an election that is 6 weeks from tomorrow, Kaylee. These countdown clocks are starting to bring some anxiety to all of us watching this as we bring the element of crypto back to the conversation. Now, we mentioned already that both presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, this week are going to be making big economic policy speeches. One tomorrow, Donald Trump in Georgia, Wednesday, Kamala Harris in Pittsburgh. It's that Wednesday address, Kaylee, I'm curious if we hear about crypto, because she was talking about it over the weekend. Got a lot of people pretty optimistic about the idea of both candidates embracing this.
Yeah, well, this is the first time we've heard her speak about crypto so directly, but it still was kind of broad strokes. She talked about it being an innovative technology, likening it to AI. AI and digital assets is what she mentioned, while protecting consumers and investors. So this isn't necessarily a pledge like Donald Trump has delivered to get rid of the current SEC chair, Gary Gensler. It's not even necessarily a promise to sign crypto market structure legislation into law, for example, like the FIT 21 bill that passed the House earlier this Congress. But it at least opens a door, and judging by the early reaction from the industry, they'll take this over nothing at all.
Well, that's absolutely right. And we wanted to talk to somebody who had a bit of sensitivity to the issue of crypto. And while we're at it, North Carolina, Kaylee, because there's a bit going on there right now, too.
Yeah, and we're going to get into all of it now with Congressman Wiley Nickel, the Democrat from North Carolina. Pleased to see you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Congressman. Of course, you sit on the Financial Services Committee, and you are a passionate advocate for crypto on Capitol Hill. So my question to you is, I know you liked what you heard from Kamala Harris over the weekend, but does she not need to go further, get more specific? As Donald Trump has been pretty specific about some of his pledges, including the fact that he wouldn't like Gensler helming the SEC anymore.
Well, you know, I want to say I loved what I heard from Vice President Harris over the weekend, really putting her in line with the bipartisan majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. That's, you know, Democrats and Republicans embracing digital innovation. The messaging that she put out was what we were encouraging her to embrace. And what it shows is a real reset on this issue and a shift from the current approach of regulation by enforcement with the SEC. You know, I know from my conversations with Vice President Harris and her team that we're going to have a forward-looking president who's going to embrace digital innovation and wants to keep those jobs here. She understands why it's important for the U.S. to be a leader in this space. So, you know, this was a very welcome policy, you know, update from her and policy proposal. But the language she's using is very specific and very important in terms of the work we're doing here in the House of Representatives, and then on, you know, when we get through the Senate to get this bill done in this Congress. So, you know, I think for folks watching, you know, this space, it was a big deal what she said.
Well, if we could put a finer point on it, Congressman, you sent a tweet over the weekend that got our attention, writing this new policy position puts her in line with FIT 21 House and Senate Democrats working to protect consumers and keep digital innovation in the United States. Do we know that, in fact, that the contents of Fit 21 are endorsed by Kamala Harris?
What we do know is that she's staking out a position that signals a shift from the current Biden administration. That's just natural with a new candidate, running in her own right. So I think that's important to point out here. And she's gonna continue to make policy proposals and elaborate on her issues. But I think if you're just talking specifically about Fit 21, what we're gonna see is what Senator Schumer has pledged to get this bill on the floor of the Senate for a vote and back to the House this year. And when he does that, it's going to be Democratic votes that push this issue, and we're going to see an improved product that I think is definitely going to be the kind of thing that can get support from a Vice President Harris and from others.
Well, and what if that becomes reality will be the result of that is different delineation between the authorities of the CFTC and SEC when it comes to regulating digital assets. But Congressman, I am curious, in your conversations with the Vice President and her team around crypto, are they suggesting to you that we will see different heads of those regulatory bodies? Who would you recommend if they decide not to keep the current occupants like Gary Gensler in those seats?
Well, I don't want to talk about what they've said, but I can talk about what I've said. And I've said that Gary Gensler has been a disaster for this administration, and his approach on digital assets has taken our country in the wrong direction in a very, very significant way. I don't think there's anyone in the U.S. Congress who thinks that Gary Gensler could ever survive a Senate confirmation for any position in the administration. So I think if anybody is trying to talk about Gary Gensler continuing on beyond his term, they're just trying to make cheap political points. I think I think there's zero chance that he ever gets confirmed for anything else, and I've said that a whole bunch. So I think his approach is gonna end when his term ends, and all I can do is just focus on making sure that if and when we get Vice President Harris as our next president, that she has a balanced approach on this issue, and that was the signal that we got from her own mouth, on these issues over the weekend.
As we spend time with Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina, I understand you could be voting as soon as Wednesday, Congressman, on a stopgap funding bill. It's on to Plan B, this one described by Speaker Johnson as clean. It's a 3-month stopgap, and he will need Democrats to pass it. Are you on board?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And for folks watching, it's going to be House Democrats who are putting people over politics and putting this issue over the top. Republicans continue to be at war with each other. The chaos and confusion I see across the aisle continues on. We're on track to be the least productive Congress in our nation's history. But this week, we are going to get a vote on a clean CR to keep the lights on. And it's going to be the majority of votes coming from House Democrats to put this issue over the top in the House, and I believe in the Senate as well. So I think that's something for folks to keep an eye on. We're here to govern. We're here to be responsible. My Republican colleagues just want to blow things up. And Mike Johnson, I don't know if he's even going to get a majority of Republicans to support this, but House Democrats will be there, and because we can't roll back the progress we're making with the economy by a huge unforced error of shutting down the federal government. So I'm very
well. So if
optimistic.
And if your optimism proves correct, that this will ultimately get passed, kick the can down the road to December 20th, when it will be the lame duck session, assuming we'll know the outcome of the election. Congressman, how messy could this get at the end of the year? Are you concerned when Mike Johnson hasn't been able to keep his party in line to get things across currently, that may actually create quite a messy situation come the end of the year and the end of this Congress?
I think reasonable minds are going to prevail, especially after the election. So much of what happens in Congress right now is driven by politics with the presidential election. The best time for bipartisan governance is for those 2 months right after an election. It's the furthest away we're going to be from the next election, which is the midterm, 2 years away. So I'm really working hard on a ton of issues to push them across the finish line. Things like Fit 21 for digital assets, and certainly getting a good, a good continuing resolution, or budget, which we actually should have passed months ago. So I think in this case we're in. I'm very optimistic that we're going to start working on this next CR or the budget, and have a ton of options that we can get moving in a bipartisan way right after the election.
Well, Congressman Nickel, there's a lot of talk about your home state of North Carolina after what happened with the lieutenant governor, a Republican running for the big job. He's the nominee for governor. Mark Robinson stopped a lot of people in their tracks last week with this story on CNN about his trolling on this porn site and some of the outrageous things that he is said to have posted. He still says none of it's true, but most of his entire senior staff has now quit. He was left last evening with just 3 campaign staffers, one of whom is his bodyguard. What do you know about this, Congressman? Had you heard any stories like these, and how does this end for Mark Robinson?
Well, I think it's going to end very well for the American people and the people of North Carolina, because we're going to have a great governor with Josh Stein. We've known this about, we've known Mark Robinson's character for quite a long time. He's totally unfit to be our next governor. I served in the state Senate when he was, the president of the Senate is our lieutenant governor, and his positions are far out of the mainstream for North Carolina. But we now know really even more about who he is. The comments he's made are horrific, disgusting, and totally disqualifying. And the fact that his entire campaign staff quit, as a group, tells you that they know that it's true as well. So I think my focus is just communicating with folks in North Carolina about the good choice they have for Josh Stein, and making it clear that if you don't condemn Mark Robinson, you stand with him, and you stand with his Nazi positions, his pro-slavery positions, and so many others that are just absolutely disqualifying. I wish we were in the news for better things in North Carolina, but unfortunately, this sad story is getting out there. But for me, North Carolina is an amazing place where y'all means all, and I think that's the message I want for folks to have as they think about the great state of North Carolina.
Well, and of course, it is a state that could ultimately decide the outcome of the presidential election as well. There's been some conversation since these allegations around Mark Robinson came to light about the downward drag he could create for Donald Trump. And yet the new New York Times Siena poll that was conducted in North Carolina from September 17th to 21st, so at least in part after these allegations came to light, still shows Donald Trump up 2 points on Harris, 49 to 47. Yes, within the margin of error, but would you expect these Robinson allegations to move that needle more materially for Harris?
I do, because Donald Trump endorsed Mark Robinson. He's still standing with him right now, and I think that's something that is important for the voters, and we're going to continue to make the case that by refusing to condemn this absolutely abhorrent behavior, these posts, the things that he said, it shows that you're with him. So I think this is going to be a huge issue for folks in North Carolina, and I'm very optimistic that it's going to put the right candidates over the top when we vote in our state starting in a few weeks with early voting.
Well, just to get back to the matter at hand this week, Congressman, and we always appreciate your being so generous with your time, is the government going to stay open through this deadline a week from today?
No, the government is going to stay open for business, and we're going to pass, thanks to Democrats, House Democrats, and our leader Hakeem Jeffries, we're going to join to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government open. We knew all along that Mike Johnson had no hand to play. He's folded like a deck of cards here, and thankfully is doing the right thing to put a bill on the floor to keep the government open. We need to just focus, all of us, on the economy. That's always the most important issue, and shutting down the federal government right now would be a disaster for our economy. Thankfully, we're going to avoid that. But I would just say, for folks watching, who's the responsible party here in Washington? Look to House Democrats and look to the vote score. You're going to see a lot more House Democrats supporting this than the other side of the aisle.
Well, we We covered a lot of ground. Congressman Wiley Nickel, the Democrat from North Carolina, whereas he says, y'all means all. Congressman, thank you for a great conversation. And Kaylee will meet up for the late edition of Balance of Power for a lot more at 5 o'clock.
Indeed. So catch us then. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week is straight ahead on Bloomberg TV and free.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live on television, radio, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Monday edition. My Monday brain is obviously not firing on all cylinders. Tim is out, and lucky for us, Stephen Carroll, one of the hosts of Daybreak Asia Europe, is with us. So great to have you here in New York.
Thanks for having me, Carl. I love what you've done with the place. My first time in the studio, and I can tell you there's a great view, you know. Good company as well, of course.
Thank you.
And you've been giving me the induction of, we had a quick sprint across New York earlier as well, you know.
He learned how a New Yorker walks really fast across town. All right, speaking of that, we've got a lot going on. I feel like markets kind of marking time a little bit. It was a big week last week with the Fed decision. So we're off our highs of the session on the equity trade. But we did sprint across town because we're going to be doing a big broadcast tomorrow. It's Climate Week, the UN General Assembly in session. So we're going to talk a lot about global macro conditions and concerns.
Yeah, that's right. And look, there are big issues that are facing all of the leaders gathering for the UN General Assembly in the midst of this climate week as well. So that's just part of the conversation that we're going to be having today as well with our guests. So we're looking at some of the other stories at the top of mind this hour as well.
That includes Intel, man. It really kind of late Friday before the close, headline crossing about Qualcomm maybe being interested. Now we talk about Apollo Global. So we're going to dig into all of that. And then we're going to get into a milestone when it comes to Florida real estate. It seems like everybody's moving to South Florida, and for the uber wealthy,
just yet.
Yeah, this price on a house, a residential, I guess, properties that have sold, definitely out of my neighborhood when it comes to, or my pocketbook, I should say. All right, a lot coming up in the next 60 minutes with Stephen and myself. First up, though, let's get a check on that trade and your top business stories. Here's Charlie Pell.
All right, I thank you very much, Carol Master and Steve Carroll. Welcome to New York. New York, we have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all advancing right now. S&P higher by 11, 57.14, up by about 0.2%. The Dow up 50 right now. That is a gain of just about 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, higher as well right now. NASDAQ up 25, up by about 0.1%. Bottom line here, yes, green on the screen, but stocks have paired gains. Treasury yields fell as traders combed through commentary from Fed policymakers for clues about the scope of further easing after last week's 0.5 percentage point interest rate cut. We've got the S&P, as I mentioned, up 0.2%, 10-year yield 3.73%, the 2-year 3.57%, gold higher by 0.2%, 26.27 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil trading lower now by 0.9%, 70.39 right now for a barrel of WTI. Sources tell Bloomberg Apollo Global Management has offered to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in Intel, providing the chipmaker with a vote of confidence in its turnaround strategy and an alternative to a potential takeover by larger rival Qualcomm. Intel right now up 4.2%, Qualcomm down 1.5%. So again, recapping, U.S. equities are higher. S&P right now up 11, a gain of 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, many thanks, Charlie Pellet. I'm Carol Master, along with Stephen Carroll of our Bloomberg Daybreak Europe team. We got to talk a little bit more about Intel. Charlie just setting it up for us, and I'm looking at a 2-day gain because we got a headline late Friday before the close, but you're looking at Intel shares now up about 7% in the past two trading days, and so we're trying to figure out what comes next for Intel.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're talking about this Bloomberg exclusive on Apollo Global Management throwing its hat and a potential financial investment into the Intel ring as well. So lots to discuss. Let's bring in Leanna Baker, who's managing editor of the Bloomberg News Deals team here in the studio. Great to see you. And from our San Francisco bureau, Ian King, Bloomberg News US semiconductor and networking reporter. Ian, I want to start with you. Intel, very popular all of a sudden among all these entities. Let's talk about Qualcomm and its interest, what you found out.
Yeah, I mean, we have to sort of point out that neither company has confirmed or said anything publicly about this. So at this point, we're relying upon our own reporting and everybody else's reporting. Our understanding is that there has been some conversation at some kind of level about the possibility of acquiring Intel. And you know, to sort of flip it back to what you guys were saying, Intel is kind of at a historically sort of vulnerable point in terms of, obviously, its share price, in terms of where its operations are. Its management believe that it's at kind of a low point before a big upswing, that it's had to spend really heavily. Others are less sanguine about this, are more worried about where it is and worried that perhaps it would be better off in other hands.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to figure out what's the right way forward. As you have reported on so well, Ian, that this has been long in coming when it comes to Intel. Leanna, I want to bring you back into this. There's the Apollo story that you guys have put out there, a Bloomberg exclusive. What do we know about a possible deal where Apollo makes a pretty substantial investment?
Apollo is already a partner of Intel. Remember, They have a joint venture with Intel in their factory in Ireland. So it's not surprising that Apollo would put their hat in the ring. That said, we don't know if Intel is going to accept this investment. We heard it's up to $5 billion. We don't have any terms. We said it's an equity-like investment. We don't know if it comes with a board seat or what Apollo would ask for to make this cash infusion, but it does show that Intel's board has some tough decisions to make on which path forward. Does it go with Qualcomm? Does it go with Apollo? Could it go with Apollo and then still, go with Qualcomm? One thing we know for sure, Broadcom, which is another name in the space which analysts have tipped as another potential acquirer of Intel, we've reported that currently they're not evaluating an offer for Intel.
I'm curious about Apollo. Is this about protecting its investment already in Intel, or is it because they're really interested and they see something here further?
Apollo is definitely opportunistic, and they love to get their hands in really complicated situations. They're also turnaround specialists, and they have some experience in semiconductors. Last year, they put in about $900 million into Western Digital, which is another sort of struggling chip maker right now. Apollo, though, has its work cut out for them if they do take this investment. How much influence will they have at Intel, which has its own management team, and Apollo might have its own interest too on making sure their investment, makes money.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's also an indication of obviously how excited Apollo are about chip makers as well. I mean, are there prospects they're going to want to go further in other places?
For now, all we know is that they're an investor in Western Digital, and they're an investor and joint venture partner in Intel, and they're looking to do more with Intel. But we should also consider that they're an American investor, and that's something that's really important here. We didn't talk about the U.S. government angle. So I'm sure the U.S. government would like to see some sort of U.S. solution to this without a foreign investor. And another thing to mention is that any investment from Apollo or someone similar would close a lot faster than a long, drawn-out merger with a rival like Qualcomm. That's something that's going to take a long time to play out, even if they do get to the finish line.
All right, so Ian, come on back in here. This is something we've talked about a lot with you, about the national security concerns and why this is such an important company, certainly to the U.S. government. How are you've covered this company for so long, and it's kind of amazing to see where we are with this company right now. How are you thinking about the different parties that are interested about Intel's future and what happens from here, and what you are hearing internally from the company?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated situation, as Liana has just alluded to. It's not just a case of two companies looking at each other and sort of deciding whether it makes sense for them to do this. Even Intel, there are multiple parts to Intel, whether perhaps Qualcomm would just be interested in Intel's design efforts, which would get it into the PC market, which would get it into the server market. Qualcomm historically has said absolutely no way do we want to become a manufacturing company. So if that's still the case, then what happens to Intel's manufacturing operations? And that's where the US government has a massive interest in bringing back manufacturing to this country, revitalizing manufacturing in this country. And then guess what? There's a country called China out there which has a massive say in this as well.
Right.
China is the largest market for semiconductors. Both Intel and Qualcomm do a huge amount of business there. China is going to have an absolute say when it comes to approving this kind of a deal.
But does that mean then, Ian, to that point, that the Apollo deal looks much simpler if you're Pat Gelsinger and trying to make, a kind of a decision or think about where to go with this as well? Does it make an Apollo move much clearer and simpler and less of the antitrust concerns and others that you've outlined?
Yeah, I mean, it's a much, much smaller deal, and really all it essentially would be doing, if it's at the level that we understand it is, will be to sort of prop up the current plan. Basically, all of these investments that Intel has been bringing into its factories from Apollo, from others, are essentially bridge loans. Basically, it's saying, hey, we're going to build this factory, help us out to build it out, and we'll pay you back with the profits we get from it later. Intel retains control in these kind of situations. $5 billion is a lot of money, but it's not in the chip business, right?
Yeah.
Plant costs 20.
Yeah, it goes really quickly, right? Hey, I think it's kind of interesting. There's another story in the Bloomberg about TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, and Samsung discussing building major new factories in the UAE. This is coming from the Wall Street Journal. So I think about this story. It's Intel specific, but there's so much going on globally in the semi space as other companies are kind of figuring out their path going forward. When it comes to Intel, Ian, what is the value beyond the national security concerns? Is it that it's a maker of chips, a designer of chips? Like, where is the real value going forward, or both?
Absolutely both, right? It's diminished as a franchise in PCs, but it's still 75-80% of the market. It's diminished in servers, but it's still 80% of the market. So those are incredible franchises with the right products. Maybe they revitalize. Maybe they never get back to 99%, which they've been at, but 80% of a market isn't a bad position to be in if you can do that in a profitable way. Its factories, up until not too long ago, were the best in the industry, okay? If you can throw the capital at them, if you can get the volume, the orders, maybe it becomes a valuable and absolutely essential asset again. So it's not dead yet, right? I mean, we're talking about picking over the bones, but it's not dead yet.
Ian, how much should we be thinking about other players in this sector as well? I mean, Broadcom sitting on the sidelines for now. Is there any chance anything is going to get exciting for Broadcom when we're thinking about this future?
I mean, the best person to ask would be Hock Tan, the CEO. He was asked that recently on his earnings, and he said, look, I'm quite happy trying to, make VMware, the acquisition they made, work. A couple of years before I'll be the other side of that. And he had a big smile on his face, figuratively, when he was saying this, because they were asking him, hey, are you interested? So he was basically saying, not right now.
Leanna, come on back in here. I am curious. I'm sure you had a pretty busy weekend, which always happens with the M&A activity and the M&A world. What are you hearing from other bankers or other bankers kind of, wait a minute, we got to be talking to our clients. Like there's other things that might pop up.
It's funny, there's two camps of bankers, it seems, around this situation. There's either the ones working on this deal who don't want to talk to us and aren't answering their phones, and then there's the ones that are chasing this, trying to get hired, and then there's the ones who are sitting on the sidelines who are saying, okay, this is a really, funky deal, Qualcomm, right. Intel, I don't know if I want to spend the time on this if, it doesn't happen. Qualcomm's other big M&A bets never panned out. You might recall they tried to buy NXP a few years ago, and that died. And
they're going through their own a little bit of a transformation.
Sure,
or trying to.
M&A is just really hard for semiconductor companies. Intel tried to buy a company called Tower, which also fell apart when the Chinese authorities kind of left it in limbo. So it's just a really tough space, and you have to know where to invest your time if you're an investment banker to see, which bets are going to pay off, because in chips it's been really difficult.
But it's interesting, isn't it, given the movement we've seen in share prices in this sector as well. This is clearly very hot property, and you kind of think that could spur further deals down the line, or is it more of a case that we're looking at these individual big names solidifying their positions?
Ian would know more about why Intel is a unique situation right now. I think their earnings report in the summer and what's been happening the past few years has made them vulnerable, as he said, to different M&A overtures. The other deals in the semiconductor space have been a lot smaller. NVIDIA, we've reported, does acquisitions, but not that large, and they usually do still attract scrutiny from regulators. So these companies are so big that whatever they do, even if it's a small tuck-in acquisition, it's going to get some attention.
When it comes to the regulatory concerns here, because it's something that comes up a lot in these conversations as well, is that regulators in Europe? Is it the US? Or is it, coming from outside of those markets?
It's all of the above, actually, when you announce a big merger.
Yeah.
Yeah, these companies, as Ian mentioned, are global, but definitely China, the regulator there, SAMR, they weigh in on these deals, or sometimes they don't weigh in at all, and they're left in limbo, and that leads to deals dying. The EU obviously will have a say, and then we have the US market, and then any country where these companies do business will have a say.
Hey, one thing I wanted to ask you, Ian, is I think about, AMD wasn't always as big a threat to Intel, right? Intel was really the big player. And then I think about NVIDIA was not always a household name, and wasn't the, when we bring up the semi space, wasn't the company we always kind of is our go-to. Companies can reboot, companies can simmer, company can shift strategies, they can do acquisitions. So, so can Intel likewise, right? There is another chapter.
That's what the management are saying. That's what the management believe up until now, that they're maintaining, look, hey, it's tough, it's tougher than we thought. Maybe we don't have the right AI chips out there right now, but come on, we have so much inherent value. We can do this, we can get back to what we were, is their pitch. But the flip side of that is this is a brutal business. This is a really, really difficult business, particularly manufacturing. You build these plants, you don't fill them, they drag you down. And that is a situation that Intel is facing, and that is why there's so much churn around it. Is this the opportunity of a lifetime? Is it ever going to be this cheap again? Or maybe this is Intel on a downward spiral. And there are lots and lots of opinions, and that explains what Liana just said was how the bankers are viewing it, how Wall Street is viewing it. Nobody can make their mind up right now. All they know is the road that Intel is on is a tough one right now. A lot has to go right.
And to that point, Ian, does that tell us that the AWS deal wasn't as important potentially to investors as we thought it was?
It was a brief shot in the arm, but we've seen this happen since Pat Gelsinger came back to the company a few short years ago. We have these brief moments of hope, and then it becomes clear, because it is clear, because it's such a tough business, that yes, it's a good sign, but the payoff is down the road, and the payoff isn't 100% certain at this point. And that's, I think, this constant tension that we're seeing, which is maybe they are doing the right thing, but good grief, so many things have to go right. And on the flip side, if you want to do a deal for Intel, so many things have to go right there. Regulatory approval, financing, everything. There's so much at stake here. It is such a complicated situation. So difficult for management and difficult for bankers and difficult for regulators who are taking a look at this.
Right, we talk about checking boxes. There's a lot that has to be checked in order for this to something to happen, whether it's a deal or some kind of investment. Having said that, I just want to ask both of you. So, Liana, is there a time frame you're thinking about? These are stories that, according to sources, I always feel like with these things, they may or may not happen. So, what are you thinking in terms of a time frame?
There's a lot to consider about what's next, but I will say that time is the enemy of deals. So the longer things take, the less likely they are to get announced. But that said, there's still so much more to report on. So we know Qualcomm's made a soft approach, but there's no official offer. So there's still, maybe in the next week or so, we'll find out more about how receptive Intel is, what was actually offered, and similar with the Apollo offer. And are there other names on the sidelines? Intel also has a partnership with Brookfield, another private equity infrastructure player. We haven't heard that they're around this, but certainly now that the Apollo name is out there, will other names come out of the woodwork?
Real quickly, Ian, so 15 seconds in terms of a time frame you're thinking about for Intel.
Yeah, I mean, some of these deals need to manifest quickly, as Liana just said, but Intel, in terms of time frame, can't afford too many more, if any, of the kind of disastrous earnings reports that we just saw. That's going to be a hard stop for them.
All right, so appreciate it. A very big company story, and certainly a big story on the Bloomberg today. Ian King, U.S. semiconductor and networking reporter at Bloomberg News out there in San Francisco. Liana Baker right here in studio. She is managing editor of the deals team, and you can read more at Bloomberg.com. Having said that, do you want to mention a story crossing the Bloomberg terminal? Boeing sweetening a contract offer for about 33,000 workers at its main Seattle manufacturing hub, seeking to overcome a strike that's been going on, as you know, for more than a week and threatening to deepen the plane makers' financial crisis. And that plan includes a general wage increase of 30% over 4 years, including a ratification bonus that's now doubled to $6,000, as well as the reinstatement of the Aerospace Machinist Performance Program bonus. Boeing putting this out in a statement. Shares, by the way, Boeing shares up about 2%. All right, we're going to continue here on Bloomberg Business Week, including getting the macro global outlook.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. More details about the Boeing story we reported a few minutes ago. Boeing has sweetened that contract offer for about 33,000 workers at its main Seattle manufacturing hub, seeking to overcome a strike that has been going on for more than a week and threatens to deepen the plane maker's financial crisis. Boeing saying that this new offer is its best and final. Boeing shares, they are pushing higher now. We've got Boeing up by just about 2%. It is an update for the U.S. stock market. We've got the Dow getting a lift from Boeing up 67, now a gain there of 0.2%, while the S&P 500 index up 14, a gain of 0.3%. NASDAQ right now up 34, a gain for NASDAQ of just about 0.2%. 10-year at 3.73%, with the 2-year 3.57%. Spot gold up 0.2%, 26.27 the ounce, and oil is moving lower. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.9%, falling on a weak outlook for fuel demand and the potential for the conflict between Iran and Israel to de-escalate after its recent flare-up. Oil shares right now higher. ExxonMobil up 1.2%. ADRs of BP up by 0.5%. Chevron shares up by 0.8%. So again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the green right now, with the S&P up by about 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Stephen Carroll here on Bloomberg Business Week. Stephen, of course, in for Tim. Safe to say it's hard to escape what's going on in New York City. I mean, you could even feel it right as we were like running across town this morning. The sirens, the traffic, it's a little hectic.
Yeah, it sure is. Look, I mean, gridlock in the streets, not a stranger for New Yorkers this time of year anyway. Of course, it's UN General Assembly week. But we want to talk a bit about the economic backdrop to all of this as well. One point today, thinking about the geopolitics and how it interacts with the economics, the US Commerce Department announcing plans to ban the sale or import of some connected car technology that has ties to Russia and China. The agency says that's based on national security concerns, but it's also part of the bigger picture of the trade tensions that play into international conversations.
Right, and something that countries have to think about, and the companies that are in those countries. So let's get to it. We wanted to look at that, as Stephen mentioned, the broad macroeconomic backdrop. So let's get into it. Bloomberg's global economy reporter, Enda Curran, joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Enda, good to be back with you. I know you're a friend, colleague, I should say, of Stephen.
We go back.
You guys go back a little bit. Let's talk about the macro global economy. We've talked, I feel like, over the last few months of U.S., the U.S. economy being really kind of the standout performer, but where are we when we look at things globally? And I'm thinking of some of what's going to be top of mind for the global leaders who will be here in New York City for the UN General Assembly this week. What's top of mind for them?
I think the biggest feeling, Carol, would probably be that, governments have pulled off a very unlikely soft landing, right? Remember, over the last few years, those leaders going up to the UN meetings would have been coming in off the back of the worst inflation crisis in decades. And the popular narrative at the time was everyone's borrowing costs are going to have to go through the roof, and there's going to be a lot of pain in the labour markets, a lot of job losses will be needed to get inflation back to where it was, and possibly even a recession. Well, broadly speaking, if you look at, say, the advanced economy world, maybe to distinguish it from the emerging market world, that hasn't really happened. Inflation has come off the boil quite dramatically over the past year or so, and now we're at a point where interest rates are starting to come down, and underneath it all, labour markets, obviously they have weakened and softened a touch, but they really haven't fallen apart the way that some people might have expected. So you'd have to say that given the circumstances and conditions that the world faced in the kind of post-pandemic years, to be at a point now where there's something of a global soft landing in play is probably a pretty as good as outcome as could have been asked for by the policymakers.
Yeah, but I mean, if you think about things like today, we had the latest PMI surveys out in Europe as well. Terrible reading for the composite, for the overall Eurozone. Weaker manufacturing, the story that we've been hearing consistently coming from Germany, but also the composite number from France, also in contraction territory. I mean, it's sort of like the sad trombone of economics that you're listening to, when you think about where things are looking in Europe. How bad is that situation, and how much is that going to be an issue that policymakers are going to be thinking about?
Yeah, you're quite right, Stephen. I mean, the headline is broadly speaking a global soft landing, but there's definitely pockets of weakness and stress, and manufacturing is one of them. Obviously, the Western European manufacturing sector seems to be under a lot of pressure. That's partly, I guess, a result of competition from China and the excess supply. That's one part of it. But manufacturing also in the US has been under pressure, despite, of course, all of the investment into, we'll say, the chip sector and the EV sector. And manufacturing in China itself is also in the doldrums. So there are certainly pockets of pain that haven't necessarily pulled off the broad soft landing that I spoke about earlier. Western Europe and Germany in particular, I think that's been well chronicled, the pressure that their sector's under. You're seeing the resistance now in Europe, Spain and Germany to the tariffs and EVs, for example, as kind of part of that mix to rev up some activity in that sector. And of course, don't forget, commercial real estate is another area that's suffered pain. So again, broadly speaking, things are better than where they thought they possibly could have been over the past few years, but no doubt, as you say, there are areas where there has been stress.
Yeah, and indeed for leaders like Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron, that could well have less of a swagger coming to this UN General Assembly, given that the things economically aren't looking great. They aren't great politically either, and of course that's a risk factor for the economies going forward as well. If we think about new and very shaky government in France, Olaf Scholz just clinging on to that electoral victory in the Brandenburg regional elections at the weekend, there's political risk feeding into where the trajectory is for these economies too.
No doubt, Stephen, and it has been the year of elections. We even had the election over the weekend in Sri Lanka, returning a government there, one government being turfed out because of the economic circumstances, another government that may take a kind of a different approach to how they're running the fiscal strategy there. As you mentioned, Western Europe, we had a tumult in France. We had the upheaval to some extent in the European Parliament. And of course, now in the US, we're waiting to see where the election goes here. And that will be so important because it's not just a very divergent economic policy set of options on the table for the US. It's quite divergent both for domestic US itself, but also, of course, what that will mean globally. On the one hand, if former President Trump gets back in, he obviously will take a much more hawkish approach to trade and maybe national security with the rest of the world. There may be some upending of old alliances, or at least alliance building being done by the Biden administration. And even apart from the national security sphere, he's certainly going to be taking a more mercantilist approach, business is business, so everybody will have to get on board to make sure they're trading their fair share, so to speak. And then if Vice President Harris gets in, probably less of a stark approach on the trade front that we think. She hasn't given that much detail on her trade policy, but maybe less stark compared to former President Biden. But still, a continuation of the tariffs, as we've seen under President Biden's administration. And of course, continued focus on national security and everything that means in terms of export controls and investment restrictions. So elections have played a huge part of economic policy this year, and I think we're all just waiting now for the big shoe to fall, which is the U.S. election.
Right, and of course there's what you hear on the campaign trail, and then there's the reality of your, sitting at that big desk in the Oval Office, and then you have to figure out policy with something or someone like China, which is so important to the global economy. We know that. Having said that, there's an important meeting that is happening Tuesday morning out of China when it comes to their economic situation. We did talk about overnight, Bloomberg News reporting about how they did cut China did one of its short-term policy rates. So they continue to take moves and initiatives to help try and juice that economy and get it going. What are your expectations for China? What are you hearing? And what should we be watching out at that meeting Tuesday morning, just tomorrow morning?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. It's infrequent, to say the least, to have these economic officials coming together, including the central bank governor. They're speaking at, I think it's 9 a.m. Tuesday morning, Beijing time. Don't obviously yet know what they're going to map out, but there's certainly some expectation that they wouldn't be speaking without offering some kind of support for the economy. A lot of the market watchers are saying maybe something in terms of a short-term interest rate cut. But of course, a lot of people are saying that's not necessarily the tonic that China's economy needs. The story there hasn't changed over the last few years now at this stage, which is basically there's been a big real estate slowdown. The authorities haven't shown the kind of urgency needed to turn that around and the kind of pain that would be needed to turn that around, which of course would be taking over the banks, taking over bad debt, recapitalizing those lenders, revving up developers to get them building and finishing those projects, etc. They've been tinkering with short-term interest rates and incentives for people to get cheaper mortgages and buying like. So the real estate story hasn't turned around. The rest of the world has been looking on and waiting to see when that will turn. I mean, we'll have the press conference tomorrow. There might be some commentary on that, but I don't think, broadly speaking, it is expected. But there is a lot of focus on whether China can meet its 5% odd growth target this year. A lot of expectation that the authorities will have to put more money into the economy at some point, but it just seems that their focus is more on national security for now, on building up our tech know-how, rather than getting like the GDP back to the sort of go-go years growth rate that we were all accustomed to over the past decades plus.
Yeah, and indeed, I mean, you spent many years covering the Chinese economy for Bloomberg Enda as well, and like this is kind of a conversation that you and I had over many years about each individual measure and whether or not it was going to produce the desired effect of shoring up GDP as well. The measures to date, as you point to, have been fairly limited in scope, although more recently targeting the property sector in particular. For markets and for the economy more writ large, how big would how big an announcement would we need to get in this press conference to actually change the narrative around the Chinese economy?
Well, if we were to, I mean, I don't know if how high expectations are for that particular press conference, but if we were, Stephen, it would have to be, I think, more public spending by the central government. You know, the kind of announcement and degree of urgency that the government is now going to intervene and they're going to do whatever steps it is, injections of capital into the banking sector, injections of money into the real economy. Maybe it's targeted infrastructure to building or development or getting money into consumers' pockets and other measures, but that kind of attempt to rev up animal spirits and investment, that would have to come from the government. That would have to be borrowing and deficit rather than shorter-term interest rates. I mean, to be clear, it's not all doom and gloom on the China story. The consumer is subdued, but it hasn't fallen through the floor the way sometimes it's projected to be. There have been some pockets of resistance overall. Exports ebb and flow a bit in terms of how it's contributing to the economy, but as I say to you, the big story remains the real estate side of it. That hasn't changed. Right. And until they make a material announcement on that narrative probably won't change in a hurry either.
Yeah, we've been talking about it for some time now at this point. Having said that, just got about a minute or so here left here, and I am curious, it's Climate Week. We're going to be doing a special broadcast from the Earthshot Prize coverage tomorrow. It's about global leaders, it's big issues, but it's also about what's going on with global climate issues. Is there too much on the economic and market plates of so many countries that climate change is not necessarily a priority? Is there some kind of broad theme there?
Oh no, I'd say it is a priority. I mean, it's an obvious issue for the economy everywhere right now. Just look at the extreme weather events, Carol. But whether or not there's consensus among governments to come to the table and whether they're willing to take the political hit and put the money on the table that's needed to make that transition is a whole other story. But I think it's clear that it's impacting economies everywhere right now.
Yeah, and we certainly have, in the U.S. and other places, certainly seen a lot of money certainly committed to it. Enda, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Bloomberg's global economy reporter Enda Kerr joining us from our D.C. bureau. Just want to remind everybody, Boeing shares, they're up about 3%. This on a headline that the company did sweeten a contract offer for about 33,000 workers at its main Seattle manufacturing hub. And that plan includes a general wage increase of 30% over 4 years. So looking to aggressively put an end to this.
Indeed, yeah, workers have been looking for 40% originally, and then that, the company previously offered 25, so this looks like the compromise offer as well. And that looks like we're getting into that best and final territory for that as well.
And Boeing would love to see this be done so it can move on, because it certainly has a lot of other issues on its plate. All right, coming up, everybody, we're going to get into the economics of high-end real estate, where the price seems to continuously go higher. We're going to tell you about where that's happening in one part of the United States. I'm Carol Massar, along with Stephen Carroll. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks are higher now as investors sift through commentary from Fed policymakers for clues about the scope of further easing after last week's half-a-point rate cut. S&P right now up 13, a gain of 0.2%. The Dow up 67, also up by 0.2%. NASDAQ up 26, an advance of 0.1%. 10-year at 3.73% with a 2-year at 3.56%. Gold up $5.50 the ounce to $26.27, up 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil now down 0.8%. WTI back above 70 at 70.42 a barrel. Biohaven shares are surging after its experimental drug slowed the progress of a rare nerve disease in a study which the company will use to seek U.S. approval later this year. Biohaven shares, they're up now by 16%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 13, up 0.2%. For our on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, got it, Charlie. Thanks so much. Well, we highlight an awful lot about everybody moving down south. I've had a lot of family members move down south.
Places to visit, Carl. This is good.
It is. It's nice and warm and toasty. But in particular, we see a lot of people going to South Florida, financial types and more. And as a result of that move, how that has led to soaring prices of homes, especially among the super rich, which brings us to a new record, perhaps, for the most expensive residents in the Miami area. Let's get to it with Danny Hertzberg, realtor at the Jills Zeter Group. It's a team within the Coldwell Banker community. It has been ranked by Real Trends and the Wall Street Journal as the #1 real estate team in the nation, Florida and Miami, for several years, including 2024. Danny joining us from South Florida, along with Bloomberg News markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle, who keeps an eye on the real estate world. She is joining us here in studio. Hey, Danny, my understanding is you guys might have some news for us about a big closing. What can you tell us?
We do. We have some very exciting news. First, thank you so much, Carol, Steve, and Abigail, and Bloomberg for having me today. We have the record sale closing today. It's the highest sale in the history of Miami-Dade County.
So, Danny, something to ask about this sale. Not so long ago, I can remember Jeff Bezos making a big purchase. I feel like it was close to $100 million, and then Ken Griffin was more than $100 million. So you're saying that this sale is more, that it tops those well-known billionaires?
So there's only been one sale in the history of Miami-Dade County that broke 100 million, which our team worked on. I was very proud to see my mom break that record at 106 million, and this surpasses that record. So this will be the all-time highest sale. It's a very significant, market update. It tells you a lot about the story of Miami and the growth of the city and the number of billionaires and high net worth individuals moving to Miami and all the big companies that have been coming down here.
Well, let's dig into that just a little bit more, Danny, because I know that prior to this pandemic gold rush for real estate, the biggest sale in Miami, if I have this correctly, I think that 47 million in 2015, and then there was another 47 million sale in 2012. Now 47 million seems like nothing. Yeah, it seems like pocket change.
Yeah. Perspective and context.
So has the table really been reset here?
Absolutely. So that 47 million record back in 2012, which we participated in, was actually on Indian Creek. So it's very interesting that the story started there on Indian Creek. And then the market spread throughout the city from Star Island to Gables Estates, north and south through Golden Beach. And then for many years, almost a decade, you didn't have a sale over 50. And since 2021, we now have had 8 sales over 50 million and 2 sales over 100 million, which is significant.
Right.
And the runner-up sales are 70 million, 75 million, 93 million. So very significant numbers for Miami, which puts us on par with LA, New York, Palm Beach, and all the major global markets.
Danny, step back, lay out this deal that you guys closed. What is this deal? Who did it? Tell us about it, because I believe it involved a couple of properties.
Absolutely.
And what the amount was.
So this was a significant assemblage on Lagos Island. The sale is just over 122 million total. It was an assemblage put together by Dr. Pierce over many years. It was 4 properties put together one by one and then assembled together. It took several years to sell this property. It was a very complicated transaction with many zoning elements. And we showed it to some of the most high net worth individuals in the world. It's the true trophy property of the city with downtown views, and we have a growing downtown. And, it's exciting the market. We're having a lot of buzz. What's interesting about this sale is not just breaking 100 million, but to have multiple offers and backup buyers.
Wow.
That kind of interest is just very telling of the market we're in.
Tell us a bit about the profile of who's getting into this market. Who's got the big and deep pockets to be able to look at properties like this? Is it American buyers? Are you getting overseas buyers in there as well?
It's a great question. So in general, these type of properties, which we focus on, the overwhelming majority of buyers have been domestic, moving from New York, Chicago, California, New Jersey, high-tax states, really moving to Florida we have no state income tax. And that's been the trend. A very small percentage have been international buyers. But when I look through the list of the largest, most significant purchases, the record-breaking sales, they've really been domestic buyers.
Okay, so Danny, you have all of these people who wanted to buy this property for more than $122 million. And I should mention, it's not for the properties, it's for the land. So these people buy these properties, knock down the homes for the land, and then rebuild.
Yeah, this is a teardown, right?
Yeah, this is a teardown. This is a teardown, $122 million teardown. But where do all those other buyers go? Surely your pipeline is stuffed. What can you tell us about the next big sale?
So we've been working on it. It's complicated because this is a true trophy property. So finding the next best alternative for people has been challenging. We've been making calls, knocking on doors, calling in, trying to convince people to move. And although this is the record, I'm confident by the end of the year, early next year, we're going to see other sales even breaking this record. It's not that there's not demand from the buyers. It's that we have few sellers at this point that are willing to move for these type of properties and the most sought after communities. So, this was a land transaction, but many of the people looking at it wanted a finished home on a large parcel, and that type of inventory just doesn't exist. So people are having to build it themselves. And land prices now for the best parcels of land, they're now $1,000 a foot for land on a land per foot basis. So we're getting creative. We're trying to put neighbors together in different communities. We're calling people. Maybe people were focused on a home. Now we're pivoting to a penthouse. So we have to get creative, but we're used to working in a tight inventory environment going back to, this really started in 2020. If we go pre-pandemic, the overwhelming majority of buyers looking at this type of property, bidding on this property would have been international buyers. So it's completely switched from majority international to majority domestic in a very short period of time.
And what sort of incentives, or are you having to put up the incentives to get these neighbors to think about putting their properties on the market? Because, I mean, if you have all the buyers, how are you incentivizing them to think about selling?
So that's been really challenging. So, one thing that's been a great carrot has been providing post-occupancy agreements, particularly when people are building or they're going to renovate. So we work it into the deal where the seller can stay for 6 months, sometimes even a year, rent-free in the property. Then they have the proceeds from the sale to find their next, property to move to. We've had all sorts of sweeteners with, quick closings, long closings, all different sorts of accommodations, even people making arrangements. And many times we've had sellers say, we'll take this deal, but only if you find me a property to go to. So it's contingent on me finding a property to move to. And that's really only happening in the highest end of the market. That's where the demand is the strongest in the Miami market, the very, very ultra high end, because you have few sellers and you have a pretty significant pool of buyers. So the post-occupancy is the lead, but really a lot of it comes down to the number. Many people, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, usually when we ask, would you consider selling? And the answer is typically no for many of these, trophy, high net worth individuals that own these type of properties. But when we frame it as, is there a number that you consider selling at with certain terms, then it opens the conversation. And sometimes people don't realize, there's many people, not everybody, but most people have a number that if it's big enough, they may move. They may, buy the property they were thinking about or make different arrangements. And we try to create a deal structure that works for everybody.
And then in 30 seconds, Danny, I happen to know that there's one property in particular that you've called remarkable with a single buyer and a single seller that you think could come to market by the end of the year or early next year above this. Can you give us any more details on that?
In more like 20 seconds, unfortunately.
So quickly, my lips are sealed, but there is a potential transaction in the works. A buyer wants a property, and we'll see if the seller will sell, but it will break this record. And there are other potential buyers out there looking right now in our market that are looking at prices above this record sale.
Got it.
And I just want to, express my gratitude to my mom,
More.
Jolie.
All right, Danny, more to come, more to come. Danny Hertzberg of the Jill Zeder Group.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, as we mentioned, it is Climate Week here in New York City. Tomorrow, Business Week will be coming to you live from the Plaza Hotel for the Bloomberg Philanthropies Earthshot Prize Innovation Summit and Global Business Forum. It's a favorite event of ours. These are events focusing on innovation, opportunity in the climate space, and really ask the question, are politicians doing enough to sell these opportunities to voters? Which is something I think about when voters so much, we know it's the economy stupid, right? They care about money in their pocketbook, things costing a lot of money. Like, where does climate stack up?
Yeah, and look, big picture, if you ask people, do they care about the environment? A lot of polls will tell you, people will tell you yes, but then how do you translate that into policy, and especially getting people to make decisions at the ballot box that might be relevant to that as well. We've seen this play out in huge swings in elections in Europe. We want to think about this with our lens in the US election as well. We've got Bloomberg opinion editor Mark Gongloff with us, who's been writing about this. He joins us from New York City with more. Mark, great to have you on. So much on our mind when we're thinking about those meetings of global leaders happening in New York this week. We've got polls around the US elections on this as well. Where does the issue of climate rank, and how does it come up for US voters?
It's very conflicted. It ranks very highly when you ask them if they care about climate change. Overwhelming majorities of Americans say they worry about climate change, they believe it's happening, and they believe that we can do something about it. When you ask them what they're going to vote on, they say they're going to vote on the economy. So those two things are very split. And then when you ask them, and this is something that I just wrote about last week, there